Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. I've always been a night owl, often working into the early hours of the morning. That particular night, I had an assignment due for work, so I decided to stay late in the office. I wasn't the only one. A few others were around, but it was mostly quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft clicking of keyboards around 2 a.m. The office began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could immediately put my finger on, just an unsettling sense that something wasn't right. The building was old, and sometimes the pipes would creak or the air conditioning would kick on with a groan. But this felt different. It felt like someone was in the building with me. I shook it off. I was just tired. The only other person in the office was Carol, who worked across the room from me. She was hunched over her desk, working on some spreadsheets, her glasses reflecting the light of her screen. I figured if something was wrong, she would notice too, but she seemed perfectly absorbed in her work. Around 3 a.m., I decided to take a short break. I stood up, stretched, and headed to the break room to grab some water. As I passed the row of cubicles, I noticed that the hallway lights flickered, but I didn't think much of it. I've seen lights go up before in this building. When I walked into the break room, the door clicked shut behind me, but when I turned around to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. I tugged at it, confused. It wasn't stuck. It just wouldn't budge. I could hear Carol's muffled voice from the other side, talking to someone. But why would she be talking to someone this late? I hadn't seen anyone else around. I pounded on the door, trying to get her attention. Carol, hey, let me out. There was no answer. Just her voice, softer now, like she was whispering. The light above flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried the handle again, but it was useless. Panic started to set in. That's when I heard it. A faint clicking sound, like footsteps on the tile floor, coming closer. I pressed myself against the door, straining to hear click, click, click. Then the whispering stopped. I could feel the presence on the other side of the door, and I wasn't alone. Something wasn't right. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. The sound was getting closer, and I could hear faint breathing, deep and uneven. It wasn't Carol anymore. This was something else. Suddenly, the lights in the break room went out, leaving me in total darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, trying to find something, anything, to orient myself. In the pitch black, I could feel a cold draft brush past me, too cold, like it wasn't supposed to be there. A low, guttural voice echoed through the darkness, but it wasn't human. Let me in. I froze. I knew that voice. It sounded like Carol, but it wasn't her. It was distorted, almost as if someone had mimicked her tone, but with a harsh, rasping quality to it. I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. I had to get out of there. I tried the door again, but it was still locked. The voice came again, this time closer, like it was right behind me. Let me in. I spun around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I darted toward the window. It wasn't locked. I threw it open, the cool air rushing in, but there was no way to climb out. The ground was too far down, and the building was surrounded by a high fence. Desperate, I looked around the room for anything I could use to break the window. That's when I noticed something strange. On the desk in the corner, there was a small framed photo of Carol, but it wasn't a photo I had ever seen before. In the picture, Carol was smiling, but her eyes weren't right. They were wide open, too wide, with no pupils, just black voids. I didn't understand it, but the hairs on my neck stood up as the shadows in the room began to twist and stretch. The air grew thicker, and I could almost feel something moving toward me, something fast. Without thinking, I lunged for the window, knocking the frame off its hinges. The cool night air poured in as I climbed out, breathing heavily. I didn't stop to look back as I ran across the parking lot, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't see Carol the next day. I didn't even hear from her. I called and left messages, but there was no response. The office was eerily quiet when I returned, and when I walked past her desk, I saw her computer still running. But when I looked at the screen, I saw a single, strange image, a distorted photo of me, exactly where I had been standing in the break room, staring at the window. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m., and in the corner of the image was a faint shadow, standing just behind me. I still don't know what happened that night, but I've never stayed late in that office again. I never thought a simple apartment would be the place where I'd experience something so terrifying. It started out like any other routine, working long hours, barely having enough time to eat, and coming back to my cramped, inexpensive apartment late at night. The building I lived in wasn't great, but it was cheap. And it was close to my job. It was an old place, with narrow hallways and flickering lights that made me feel like I was in a horror movie. Most of the tenants were quiet, reclusive types, people who just wanted to live in peace without much hassle. One evening, I returned from work and noticed something off. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, not wide open, just a crack, as if someone had left in a hurry or forgotten to fully close it. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that unease creeping in. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, like it wasn't circulating properly. I closed the door behind me and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Everything seemed in its place, no signs of a break-in, no obvious disturbances. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until I went to the bathroom that I found it. The mirror. It wasn't cracked, but it was smeared. I could see fingerprints along the edges, almost like someone had pressed their hands against it and slowly moved them around, leaving greasy streaks. I didn't know how I didn't notice it earlier. I had been in the bathroom just that morning. I wiped the mirror clean, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing faint noises, scraping sounds, like nails dragging against the floor. They weren't constant, but every now and then, I'd hear them from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old structure making strange noises, but then I heard something else. A whisper, just outside my door. It was a voice, soft and almost melodic, but it made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't my imagination. It was clear, too real to ignore. The whispering continued, a low hum that seemed to get closer with every passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, wondering if someone had broken in. But if they had, why didn't they make a sound when they came in? I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I stood still for a moment, waiting for any sound. The whispering stopped, and I thought I'd imagined it. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped out into the hallway and looked around. Nothing. It was just the usual dim lighting and the closed doors of other apartments. But the air felt wrong, colder than usual. As I walked back to my apartment, I glanced toward the elevator. It was an old, creaky thing, but it was never in use at night. Except tonight, it was moving, slowly, the lights flickering as it descended. I froze. The elevator doors opened, and no one was inside. I didn't waste another second. I rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was losing control of everything, my thoughts, my senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me for days. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The next morning, I went to the landlord's office to ask about the strange events. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. She looked at me with a concerned expression when I mentioned hearing noises and seeing the elevator move on its own. "Oh, that happens sometimes," she said, her voice low and almost too calm. "The building has a history." I was about to ask her what she meant when she continued, "People hear things in this place, footsteps, whispers, and sometimes the elevator moves by itself. It's just the old pipes. You know, the building settles." She smiled politely, but there was something off about her tone. "Don't worry, though, it's harmless." I didn't feel reassured. That night, the same strange things happened again. The whispering, the scratching, the elevator. But this time, something changed. The whispering wasn't just a voice, it was my voice. It was me, but not me. A distorted, mocking version of my own voice. saying things I hadn't even thought. Things like "you're still here and it's only just begun." Panicked, I rushed to the bathroom to see if I was imagining things. But then I saw the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my reflection. There was a woman standing in my place, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite recognize. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and she was smiling. I stumbled back, almost falling over, and as I turned to run, I heard her voice, clear as day, from behind me. "You're not leaving." We wanted a break from the city, a chance to disconnect and enjoy the quiet. The cabin was old but charming, situated at the edge of a dense forest. We were excited to leave behind our phones, forget about work, and just relax. The first night was perfect. We cooked dinner together, cracked open a few beers, and sat around the fire. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The kind of peace you can't get anywhere else. Around midnight, we all went to bed. My room was upstairs, and as soon as I laid down, I noticed how still everything felt. No wind, no sounds from the woods, just silence. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it kept nagging at me. It was too quiet. Then I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, 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 slow and rhythmic. My heart raced, but I told myself it was nothing. I turned on my side, pulled the blankets over my head, and tried to sleep, but the tapping didn't stop. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, heart pounding, and walked over to the window. I peeked through the curtains, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind, but there was nothing, just darkness. I stood there for a few moments, confused, but then I heard it again, this time from the back of the house. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. It was impossible. I was the only one upstairs. My friends were all downstairs, or so I thought. I grabbed my phone, texted the others, and asked if they were messing with me. No reply. I quietly went downstairs, trying not to make a sound. As I reached the bottom, I saw the front door slightly ajar. That was strange. None of us had gone outside. I pushed the door open, thinking someone had gone for a walk, but there was no one there. The house was eerily quiet now. No voices, no sounds. I called out, but my voice echoed back to me, swallowed by the silence. Then I heard it, a soft whispering, coming from the kitchen. I stepped into the room, but when I switched on the light, it was empty. The whispering stopped. I started to turn away, but then I noticed something on the floor, a set of muddy footprints, leading from the back door to the kitchen. They were fresh. My heart stopped. I followed the trail through the house, my mind racing. The footprints led into the hallway, and then, as if on cue, the floorboards creaked above me. Someone was upstairs. I rushed up the stairs, but when I reached the top, the hallway was empty. No one was there. That's when the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The door was shut tight now, locked. I was sure I hadn't closed it. I stood there, staring at the door, when I heard something else. The faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the attic. I hadn't even noticed the door to the attic until now. It was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it unnerving. I didn't want to go up there. I wanted to leave, to drive away as fast as I could. But the footsteps were getting closer, and I felt like I had no choice. I pulled open the attic door, the old wood creaking, and climbed the narrow stairs, my breath tight in my chest. The room was dark, but as I switched on the light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a mirror in the attic. It wasn't there when we arrived. It hadn't been in any of the photos from the listing, but there it was, standing in the center of the room, framed in thick black wood, and standing in front of it, staring back at me, was me, a perfect reflection, but something was off. The reflection was grinning, wide and unnerving, its eyes hollow and dark. I blinked, and the figure in the mirror did the same, but with an expression I didn't recognize. It smiled wider, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, but then it wasn't just in the mirror anymore. The thing was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The attic was empty, except for the mirror. I couldn't breathe. I didn't understand. It was like the reflection. It wasn't just a reflection. I ran out of the attic, down the stairs and grabbed my phone. I called my friends, but none of them answered. I had to leave, but when I opened the door, I saw them standing in the yard. Their faces were blank, staring ahead. It wasn't until I reached the car that I realized they weren't really there. The cabin was abandoned when we left. There were no footprints, no signs anyone had ever been there. And as we drove away, I looked back. In the window of the cabin, I saw something. A figure, grinning, watching me leave. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. When I looked in that mirror, I didn't see me. I worked the late shift at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It's a quiet place, usually empty except for the occasional late-night shopper. For the most part, I'm used to the silence, the hum of the fridge, and the occasional flicker of the lights. But one night, something happened that I'll never forget. It was just after midnight when the first strange thing happened. I was stocking the shelves, minding my business, when the doorbell rang. I looked up, but no one came in. I figured maybe the bell was just malfunctioning. These old places always have something wrong with them. But it rang again, followed by the sound of footsteps. I glanced over the counter, but no one was there. I shrugged, dismissing it. There was no one in the aisles either. A quick check of the front parking lot showed nothing out of the ordinary, thus the dim glow of the street lights. As I went back to restocking, the air grew suddenly cold, much colder than usual for the time of year. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the aisles. As if someone were walking in circles around the store. My heart began to pound in my chest. I checked the security monitor, but the footage showed no one. Just an empty store. The store was practically a ghost town at night, and we rarely got customers at this hour. I reached for the phone behind the counter, ready to call the manager. But before I could, a strange voice interrupted my thoughts. It was a whisper, like a breath against my ear. "You can't leave." I spun around, but again, there was no one. No one visible, no one even close. The store was still empty. At this point, I thought I was just overtired. It had been a long shift, and the solitude was getting to me. So, I went to the break room in the back to grab a coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves. When I stepped inside, I froze. The door to the small storage closet was wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. With my heartbeat pounding in my ears, I slowly walked over and peeked inside. Nothing, just empty shelves and boxes. But then, a sudden shiver ran down my spine as I noticed something odd. A small, nearly imperceptible smudge on the floor. A drag mark, like something heavy had been pulled across the ground and then quickly wiped away. My stomach churned. I quickly shut the door and bolted back out into the main store, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. That's when it happened. The lights flickered just a brief blink, but it was enough. The moment they came back on, I saw him, a man. He was standing at the far end of the store, by the refrigerated section. He wasn't looking at me. He was just staring at the glass doors, as if waiting for something to happen. I felt my blood freeze. I hadn't heard him enter. No bell, no footsteps. He was just there. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But I had to approach him. I couldn't just ignore him. "Can I help you, sir?" I called out, my voice shaking. The man didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the door. I tried again, louder this time, but still no answer. I took a few cautious steps toward him, my eyes fixed on his still form. As I got closer, I realized something was off. His clothes rolled worn out, faded, and his skin had a pale, almost sickly appearance. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but the moment my fingers brushed his coat, he turned toward me, and I recoiled. His face was a blur, distorted, like a bad photograph. It flickered, shifting between different faces. His eyes, though, they stayed the same, hollow and black, staring through me. I could barely breathe. Before I could react, he was gone, vanished, without a sound. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. I grabbed my coat, prepared to leave. As I stepped outside, I noticed something. A small piece of paper stuck to the door frame. I pulled it off and saw a message written in faded, spidery handwriting. "You can't leave." I drove straight home, that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? What did he want? The next day, I went back to work, trying to brush off what had happened as just a bad dream. But when I opened the door to the store, I froze. The same message was written on the door frame. I looked around, everything else was as it had been. The store was still empty, but the air was different. The silence was thicker now, as if something was waiting, and it hasn't stopped. Every night, without fail, I hear the footsteps. The whispers, I can feel it. That man, he's still here. Watching, waiting, and now ... I'm afraid I'll never be able to leave. It started on a late autumn night when a friend and I decided to explore an abandoned house just outside of town. It had been empty for decades, the kind of place that fueled urban legends. People whispered about lights flickering in the windows and strange noises coming from inside. Naturally, we were curious, the way only young people, with nothing better to do, could be. The house was enormous, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of neglect. The windows were broken, and the front door hung on rusted hinges. We had brought flashlights, but I remember the beams barely cutting through the dense darkness inside. The air smelled of mildew and rot. Leaves crunched underfoot as we stepped onto the warped floorboards. The entryway opened into a cavernous living room. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts in the gloom. A grand staircase loomed to the left, its banister coated in cobwebs. We agreed to start upstairs, feeling braver together. The steps groaned beneath our weight, each creak reverberating through the empty house. As we reached the landing, I noticed the unsettling silence. No wind, no animal sounds. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The first few rooms were empty, just peeling wallpaper and broken glass. But the third door was different. It was shut tight, unlike the others that swung open with ease. I felt a strange resistance when I turned the knob, as if something was pressing back from the other side. My friend joked that it was probably swollen from the damp, but I could see he was uneasy too. When the door finally gave way, it revealed a small bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, and a child's bed frame sat against one wall. But what drew my attention was the dresser. Its mirror was intact, unlike the broken shards scattered throughout the house. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection, the room wasn't empty. There was a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the corner, but there was no one there. I glanced back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. My friend had seen it too. He was pale, his flashlight shaking slightly. Neither of us said a word, but we backed out of the room. Shutting the door firmly behind us, we decided to leave, suddenly feeling like we had overstayed our welcome. As we descended the staircase, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The house seemed darker now, the air heavier. Just as we reached the front door, we heard it. A loud crash from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. My friend looked at me, his eyes wide. Against my better judgment, I suggested we check it out. I didn't want to be the person who ignored something like that, only to regret it later. We crept back up the stairs, every creak of the wood amplifying the tension. The crash had come from the same bedroom. This time, the door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we found the room exactly as we had left it except for the mirror. It was shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. The frame was twisted, almost as if it had been torn apart by something stronger than human hands. I knelt to pick up a shard, curiosity overriding fear. That was when I noticed something chilling. The pieces of glass reflected not just us, but the entire room except for the space behind us. It was blank, a void where the rest of the room should have been. I dropped the shard and stumbled back, my breathing ragged. That was when we heard the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A single word, drawn out and raspy. Leave. It didn't sound like a plea or a warning. It sounded like a command. My friend didn't wait. He bolted down the stairs, and I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The house stood silent and still, its dark windows staring back at us. But, as we turned to leave, I saw something in the upper window. A shadow. Unmoving. Watching us. We drove back to town in silence, neither of us wanting to talk about what had happened. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something chilling. The mirror in my bedroom, which I had owned for years, had a crack running through it. And in that crack, faintly, I could see the outline of a figure. I never thought camping in the wilderness would be anything but peaceful. My friends and I had planned it for months, picking a remote spot deep in the woods far from the noise of civilization. We were seasoned campers, ready to embrace the quiet solitude of nature. Or so we thought. We arrived late in the afternoon and set up camp, a small fire crackling as dusk began to settle. The forest around us seemed alive, every rustling leaf and snapping twig hinting at something just out of sight. But we laughed it off, sitting around the fire, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows. By the time the fire was dying down and the shadows grew long, the full moon cast an eerie glow on the trees. It was then that I first felt a faint unease, something creeping at the back of my mind, but I shrugged it away. We were safe. We were all together. As the night grew colder, I noticed how unusually quiet the forest had become. No crickets, no owls, no distant calls of animals. It was as if the entire world had frozen. I glanced around at my friends, each of them staring into the fire, their faces lit with an orange glow. Suddenly, a snap of a twig broke the silence. Sharp and sudden, we all froze. It was too distinct, too deliberate to be an animal. I stood up slowly, trying to peer into the darkness beyond our camp. Nothing, just trees, swaying lightly in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Trying to shake off the paranoia, I went to fetch more wood from the pile we had gathered earlier. As I turned my back to the fire, I heard a soft rustling sound behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The fire crackled, and for a brief moment, the world was bathed in light, but there was no one there. My friends hadn't moved, still fixated on the fire. I frowned, convinced it was the wind or my imagination. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the woods. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall, thin, and hunched. My stomach dropped. I stepped back toward the camp, my eyes never leaving the shadow. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They all looked at me, confused. "See what?" One of them replied. I shook my head. Maybe it was just my nerves. "Nothing. Never mind." I stayed by the fire, but I couldn't stop watching the woods. The figure was still there, unmoving, but somehow, I knew it was staring right at me. I wanted to scream, but something told me if I did, I might invite whatever it was to approach. My instinct screamed for us to leave, but I couldn't move. After what felt like hours, the figure finally vanished, blending into the shadows as if it had never been there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. Whatever it was still out there. We spent the rest of the night in silence, the fire burning low, our eyes darting nervously around the camp. None of us wanted to speak of what had happened, but we all felt it. The heavy, suffocating presence of something watching us. When morning finally arrived, we were exhausted, but the woods were peaceful again. The birds were singing, and the sun filtered through the trees like it always had. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. As we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed. Every sound, every rustling branch, made me jump. When we reached the clearing where we'd parked, I turned for one last look at the forest. That's when I saw it again, just beyond the tree line. The same figure, standing motionless, watching us. But here's the twist: the figure wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, scattered throughout the woods, all standing perfectly still, all watching us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. As one of them stepped forward. It was then that I realized something far more chilling. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. I could feel my blood run cold as it tilted its head slightly, as if studying us. I turned to my friends, but they were already moving, running without a word, all of us scrambling to get to the car. We didn't look back until the engine roared to life, and we were speeding down the road. We made it back home, safe and sound. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about that night. The things we saw in the woods weren't just watching us, they were waiting for something. Waiting for us to make the wrong move, to stray too far, to stumble into their territory. We were lucky to get away when we did. And the scariest part, I've never gone camping again. It was a regular Tuesday when I walked into the office building, just like any other day. The usual hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of people on phones, and the murmur of keyboards filled the air. But there was something different that day, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost as if the building was holding its breath. I work in a corporate office on the 14th floor of a 30-story building. My team occupies the west wing, farthest from the elevator, at the end of a long corridor. That day, when I walked to my desk, I noticed something odd, a stack of papers on my chair. I hadn't left any papers there the day before, and when I checked the stack, I saw it wasn't mine. It wasn't from anyone on my team either. At first, I assumed someone must have left it there by mistake. But when I picked it up, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I looked around the office. Everyone was at their desks, working as usual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off and put the stack on my desk. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The lights seemed to flicker a little more than usual. The hum of the building had a different quality to it, almost like a low growl vibrating in the walls. I was distracted, but I kept working, pushing the feeling aside. Then came the first incident. It was mid-afternoon when I went to the restroom on the 13th floor. I took the elevator down and walked through the hall. The lights in the corridor were dimmer than usual, and I noticed a strange silence, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I was alone in the hallway, but when I reached the restroom, the door swung open on its own. I assumed it was the wind or an automatic sensor, but when I stepped inside, I was hit with a nauseating smell. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of an office restroom. This one was sharp, like rotting metal, and it made my stomach churn. I was alone in there. No one else was in sight, but I had the distinct impression that someone was standing behind me. I turned quickly, but the bathroom was empty. Nothing but flickering lights above me and the smell that wouldn't go away. I tried to ignore it and finish what I came for, but I felt as though I was being followed out, the sensation of unseen eyes on my back. That night, after work, I stayed later than usual. I had a big project deadline coming up, and I was determined to finish. The building had emptied out by then. Only a few of us remained. As I worked, I noticed the temperature in the office was dropping. It felt like the air conditioning had gone on overdrive. My fingers were stiff, and I had to wrap my jacket around me. Around 9 p.m., I finally called it a day. I packed my things and walked toward the elevator. The hallway was eerily quiet, and when I stepped into the elevator, I heard the sound of a door closing behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The elevator moved down slowly, and I pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator stopped abruptly between floors, and the lights flickered. I stood there, confused, until I heard something I will never forget, a knock. It came from somewhere behind me in the darkness. 3 distinct knocks on the metal walls. My heart pounded in my chest. I pressed the emergency button, but no one responded. The elevator continued to hum, vibrating ever so slightly. I could still hear the knocking, but now it wasn't just behind me. It was all around me, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. Then, I felt a cold breath on my neck. It wasn't the air conditioning. This was something else. My body tensed as I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the dim light reflecting off the metal walls. The elevator jolted back to life and moved down. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I didn't look back. I rushed out of the building, barely glancing at the lobby. I've never been able to shake that feeling. Something was in there with me. The next morning, I went in early, determined to forget what had happened. I even made a point to take the stairs instead of the elevator. As I walked to my desk, I froze. There, sitting on my chair, was the same stack of papers from the day before, but this time, there was a note on top. "You'll never leave." I've been in that office every day since, but the unease never leaves. The air is always thick, always heavy, and the knocks still echo sometimes, though I can never find the source. I don't know what it is, who it is, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not alone, and I don't think I ever will be again. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural until that weekend at the cabin. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. A few friends and I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. The plan was simple: relax, unwind, get away from everything. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sun was bright, and everything felt right. That was until night fell. As we sat around the fire, the atmosphere changed. The woods became unnervingly silent, not a single animal stirring. The wind, which had been light and playful during the day, had turned harsh and insistent, rattling the windows and sending a cold draft through the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but something about the way the air felt was unsettling. Around midnight, I went upstairs to my room, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down. The others continued drinking and laughing downstairs. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard a soft tapping, 3 quick knocks at my door. I froze. My heart pounded, and I held my breath. The knocking came again, but this time it was followed by a voice. A whisper. "Let me in." I shot out of bed, but there was no one outside. The hallway was empty. My hands were trembling as I stepped back to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. Nothing. It was as if the house had gone completely still again. I turned the doorknob cautiously and opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty, and I thought I might be losing my mind. I stepped out, looking around, but nothing seemed out of place. The air was colder now, and the silence felt heavier. I went back to my room and locked the door, but the eerie feeling didn't fade. I tried to sleep, but the knocks continued, faint but persistent, coming from all directions. Each tap felt like it was right outside my door, but when I opened it, nothing was there. The next morning, I didn't say anything to the others. They would have laughed at me. But as we were sitting down to breakfast, Mark, one of my friends, mentioned something strange. I swear I heard knocking last night, around midnight. I thought I was just imagining it, but it didn't stop. It was like someone was at the door. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just me. The others had heard it too? I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That afternoon, we decided to go for a hike in the woods. The trees were dense, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. As we walked, I felt a growing sense of unease, like we weren't alone. Every time I turned around, it felt like something was watching us from the shadows. When we returned to the cabin, the front door was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of it. We had locked it before we left, but the door was open, and the house was eerily quiet. We cautiously stepped inside, and that's when we saw there was a small, neat pile of dirt on the floor, just inside the door. It wasn't from outside, it was too fine, like dust. A chill ran down my spine. We hadn't been gone long enough for something like that to accumulate, but when I looked closer, my blood went cold. Written in the dust was a single word: leave. We didn't stay another night. The unease was too much to ignore, but as we packed up and left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out. The woods were silent again, and the wind had stopped, but it felt like we were being watched. As I drove home, I tried to convince myself it was just a series of coincidences. But then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the back seat, behind me, I saw a face, faint, pale, and watching me. I swerved, pulling over to the side of the road. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but when I checked the rearview mirror again, the same face was reflected. It wasn't mine. I don't know what followed us that weekend. I don't know what was at the cabin, or what knocked on our door. But I know one thing. Whatever it was, it didn't stay there. It came with us. And now, every time I look in a mirror, I wonder who is watching me. I've always been the skeptic in the group. Ghosts, monsters, all that stuff, never bought into it. But what happened to me that weekend changed everything. I still can't explain it. A few friends and I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The kind of place you'd see in horror movies. Old, isolated, with trees crowding in all around. When we got there, the place was exactly as advertised: quiet, remote, perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. We unpacked, cracked open some beers, and spent the night swapping stories and playing cards. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, unnaturally quiet, no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I didn't say anything at first. I chalked it up to being out in the middle of nowhere, but it felt off. That night, as we settled into our rooms, things started to get weird. I was in the downstairs bedroom, one of those with a single window that looked out into the woods. The others were upstairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a normal feeling of being watched. It was as if something was waiting for me. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud bang. It sounded like something hit the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The wind was howling outside, but it wasn't that, it was something else. Then came the soft scratching sound, like nails on the wood. It came from just outside my window. I lay there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I could call someone, but the screen was blank. No signal. I had to check. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, my heart racing. I peeked outside, but all I could see was darkness. No movement, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. I was about to turn away when I saw a shadow, just at the edge of the trees. It didn't move like a person, more like a cloud shifting unnaturally in the night. My stomach dropped. I quickly pulled away from the window and ran back to the bed, locking the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my friends. I figured it was just a bad night, and maybe they'd think I was overreacting. But then one of them, Sam, mentioned something strange. I don't know, but last night. I thought I heard something tapping on my window, he said, looking around at us. I thought it was a branch at first, but it sounded like someone knocking. My blood ran cold. I wasn't the only one. That afternoon, we all decided to hike to the nearby creek to clear our heads. It was a peaceful walk, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was following us. Every time I turned around, the woods seemed to close in a little more. I told myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling stayed with me. We returned to the cabin later that day, and things felt off. The air felt thick, like we were being watched. We were sitting in the living room when we heard the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. We all froze. Sam stood up, walking to the door. It's probably just an animal, he said, but his voice was shaky. He opened the door. No one was there, but that wasn't the worst part. The door had been left ajar when we arrived. But now, the door was slightly pushed open. It was as if something or someone had been waiting for us to leave the room before making its move. We didn't stay much longer after that. We packed our things and left as quickly as we could. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that I thought to check my phone. Still no signal. But the real kicker came when I saw the pictures I'd taken earlier of the cabin. One of the photos was blurry, taken from the window of my room. In the background, just barely visible, was a face. A face peeking out from behind a tree, grinning, with eyes that didn't look human. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that was waiting for us to leave so it could follow us. It's still out there. And I'm not sure if it's ever really going to leave. My friends and I were excited for a weekend getaway. We rented a cabin in a remote area, far away from the noise and chaos of city life. None of us were really into anything spooky, and we thought it would be a peaceful escape. The cabin itself was old but charming, with wood-paneled walls and an inviting fireplace. We arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked, and decided to explore the surrounding woods. There were no trails, just thick, dense trees that seemed to go on forever. It was peaceful, almost quiet. I felt like we were the only people on Earth, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. That evening, after dinner, we gathered around the fireplace and told stories. We laughed a lot, drank wine, and enjoyed each other's company. But as night fell, the wind picked up. It howled against the windows, and the old house creaked under the pressure. We joked about the house being haunted, But it was all in good fun until things took a turn. Around midnight, we heard something from the back of the cabin. It sounded like a door creaking, followed by heavy footsteps. At first, we thought it was just the house settling. But when the footsteps grew louder and closer, I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The others looked at me, their faces as confused as mine. But no one said anything. We waited, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slowly, deliberately. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving through the house. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's messing around?" I asked, trying to sound brave. No answer. I glanced around at my friends, but they looked just as scared as I felt. We all gathered near the hallway, straining to hear. The sound of footsteps was so close now that I could almost feel them vibrating through the floorboards. One of my friends, Ryan, slowly crept toward the hallway. He mustered the courage to call out, "Hello. Who's there?" No response. The silence after that was deafening. Then, suddenly, the floorboards creaked loudly from the other side of the room, followed by a sharp knock on the wall. We all jumped. "Okay, that's it. Let's get out of here," said Sarah, her voice shaky, but we couldn't leave. The wind had picked up so strongly outside that the front door was now jammed shut. The knocking from the other side of the room persisted, growing louder. Like someone was trying to get in. We huddled together in the living room, terrified. We thought about calling the police, but none of us had a signal on our phones. The atmosphere was thick with dread. Then, the lights flickered, and the knocking stopped. A cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. I looked toward the front door. It was slightly ajar. I swear it hadn't been when we had last checked. We moved as a group, cautiously toward the door. Ryan tried to close it, but the handle wouldn't turn. He pulled harder. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. We screamed, and then, the voice came soft at first, but growing louder. "Let me in," it whispered. We all froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside the door, though. It was coming from inside the cabin. The voice seemed to echo through the walls, reverberating all around us. I was about to turn and run when I noticed something strange. The air near the fireplace seemed to shimmer. At first, I thought it was the heat from the flames, but then I saw an outline, like a figure standing in the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, their faces pale and wide-eyed. We had to leave. But how? I ran toward the back door, desperate to find a way out, but as soon as I opened it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure was standing in the yard, just beyond the threshold, watching us. I slammed the door shut and turned to my friends. We were trapped, and that's when the whispering started again, louder, clearer. "Let me in." It was the same voice as before, but now it sounded closer, as if it was right behind me. We all bolted for the front door, desperate to escape. When we opened it, the wind howled, and we ran out into the woods without looking back. We made it to our car, heartbeats racing. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us leave. I'll never forget that feeling of being watched. We made it out, but that place wasn't empty. Something had been there with us the entire time. Something that was still waiting for us to return, and I don't think it will ever stop. I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were all just stories. But that weekend in the cabin changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway. A few friends and I rented an old cabin up in the woods, far from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just a few days to unwind. We arrived just before sunset, the cabin looking exactly like you'd expect from a secluded retreat, small, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, sipping drinks and chatting. The place felt cozy, warm even. But as the evening went on, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, we heard faint knocks on the windows, but when we checked, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, when we were heading to bed, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was ajar. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off. We were all tired, and the subject was dropped. The night was quiet at first. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Like someone was knocking at the door. I lay there frozen, listening. The knock stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't stop the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Then came a low voice, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It whispered my name. Let me in. I sat up in bed, heart racing. My mind raced to explain it away. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke. But when I looked around, everyone was sound asleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The voice came again, louder this time. Let me in. The door to my room creaked as if something was gently pushing against it. I wanted to scream, to wake up my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like whatever was outside could hear my every breath, my every movement. I didn't dare make a sound. The door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and I froze. But there was nothing there, no person, no figure. Just the dark, empty hallway. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs shake as I got out of bed. I crept toward the door, my every instinct telling me to run, but I had to know what was going on. I stepped into the hallway, and as I looked down at the basement door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The door was now wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no way it had been left open. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. I shone my light around, scanning the dark corners, the old shelves, the dusty floor. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it, a mirror. Old, cracked, with a thick layer of dust covering it. But it wasn't the mirror that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection. I saw myself standing there, flashlight in hand, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was twisted, eyes hollow, grinning in a way I never would. It was like looking at a version of myself that wasn't human. I stepped back in shock, tripping over a box behind me. As I fell, I turned around to find the mirror was gone, vanished, just like that. I ran back upstairs, shaking with fear. When I reached the top of the stairs, the knocking on the door started again, louder, more frantic, and the voice whispering my name again, calling to me. Let me in. I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't want to even look at it, but somehow, I found myself at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. Just empty air, the hallway stretching before me. But that's when I noticed that the mirror it was in the hallway now, standing in front of my bedroom door. And as I stared into the reflection, I realized with horror the twisted version of myself was still there, smiling back at me. I never liked working late. There's something eerie about being the only person left in a building when the lights flicker and the halls echo with your footsteps. But this was a deadline I couldn't ignore. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. As I typed away at my desk, my phone had died hours ago, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. The office was supposed to close at midnight, but everyone else had left, and I was alone, finishing up some last-minute work. I tried not to think about the strange occurrences that had been happening over the past few nights. At first, I chalked it up to being tired or paranoid, but now, something didn't feel right. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, and every now and then, I could swear I heard something, a soft tap-tap, like fingernails on a desk. I shook it off. It was probably just the building settling, the air conditioning groaning. But as the sound persisted, I started to feel uneasy. The tap-tap became more frequent, like someone was walking around the office, except I was the only one here. My heart began to race. I glanced at the door. It was shut tight, as it had been all night. But then I heard something I couldn't ignore, a loud, distinct click, like a door unlocking. I froze, staring at the door. The office was locked. I was sure of it. I checked the entrance when everyone left, but now it was open a crack, just wide enough for someone or something to slip through. I stood up slowly, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. There was no way I was imagining this. I reached for my phone, but of course, it was dead. I didn't even have a flashlight. I couldn't afford to stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door. As I stepped closer, I saw the silhouette of someone standing in the hallway. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and seemed to be staring straight at me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was obscured by shadows. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, the figure slowly turned and walked down the hallway, its footsteps echoing off the walls. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to cooperate. Then the sound came again, tap tap tap, louder now, like it was walking toward me. I turned to look, my stomach dropping as I saw the figure reappear at the end of the hallway. This time, it was closer. It was no longer walking, it was floating toward me, gliding across the floor with an eerie smoothness. And as it neared, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. There was just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing continued to glide closer, and I realized I couldn't escape. The exit was too far, and the figure was moving faster than I could. But just as I thought I was about to be caught, the figure stopped. It hovered in place, and for a long moment, it did nothing. My breath came in sharp gasps, my body frozen in fear, and then I heard a voice. Not from the figure, but from somewhere deeper in the office. "Why are you still here?" The voice was faint, like it came from behind a wall, but the question struck me to my core. It was not an accusation, but a statement. Why was I still here? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't think of one. I just wanted to get out, but before I could move, the lights above me flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the office into total darkness. I heard the figure move again, closer now. Its footsteps were right behind me, growing louder, faster, as if it was closing in. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, silent office. I ran to the door and yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I made it to the stairwell and down to the lobby. As I burst through the front door into the night air, I could finally breathe again. The next day, I went to the office early, hoping I had just imagined the whole thing. But when I arrived, everything seemed off. The lights were flickering, and the air felt thick, as if it had been waiting for me. I went to my desk, and there, sitting right in the middle, was my phone fully charged and open to a message that hadn't been there before. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Don't come back." I didn't return to the office after that. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it's still watching. And I have no idea what it wants, but I know one thing for sure: I won't be working late again. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm: worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again, gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from just beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there, nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. We never planned on staying at the old inn. It was a last-minute decision, one of those spontaneous trips where you just pick a place and go. My friends and I had rented a cabin a few hours away from the city, hoping for a weekend of peace and fun. When we arrived, though, the place felt wrong. There was something about it like a faint, suffocating presence in the air that made my skin prickle. The inn looked fine at first glance, but the moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. We checked in with the manager, a pale woman with hollow eyes who barely looked up from her desk. She handed us a key and muttered something about the inn being under renovation, but her words barely registered. It wasn't until we reached our room that the unease settled in. The door groaned as we opened it, revealing an oddly furnished space with peeling wallpaper and a single window covered by heavy curtains. It felt like time had stopped there. The air was stifling, thick with something that made me uneasy. That night, we decided to explore the inn. It was late, but curiosity got the best of us. We wandered through the long hallways, the wooden floorboards echoing under our footsteps. The place was eerily quiet, no sounds of other guests, no laughter, no voices, just silence, broken by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then, we heard it. A soft, slow tapping, like fingernails against wood. The sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. The tapping came again, this time closer, and a shiver ran down my spine. We reached a door at the end of the hall, one that looked different from the others. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it all the way. We pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the room was dark, but there was an old-fashioned mirror on the wall, one of those large, full-length ones. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. There was a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I felt a chill run through me, and my friends laughed, thinking it was a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned away quickly, but the tapping sound came again, this time much louder, right outside the door. It was fast now, frantic, like something was desperate to get in. We all rushed out of the room, our nerves on edge. The hall was empty, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt colder, the silence heavier. We walked back toward our room, the tapping following us, echoing down the corridor. My heart raced as we reached our door. The key wouldn't fit into the lock, no matter how many times I tried. It was as if the door itself didn't want us inside. Finally, I pushed the door open with force, and we rushed inside, locking it behind us. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint, whispering voice. It was too faint to understand, but it was there scraping at the edges of my mind. I sat on the bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, just a product of the late hour and a creepy atmosphere. But then the room grew unnaturally cold. I looked at the mirror across from me. The reflection was different now. It wasn't me standing there, it was someone else. A figure in tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows, but their eyes were glowing, watching me. The tapping stopped. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Let me out," it whispered. I jumped back, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the door to our room creaked open, slowly, on its own. I rushed to shut it, but the door didn't move. It was stuck, like something was holding it from the other side. In the reflection, I saw the figure step toward the door. And then it spoke again, louder now, as if it was right beside me. "You shouldn't have stayed." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the force of it rattling the walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to my friends, but they were all staring at the mirror, wide-eyed, as though they were seeing the same thing I was. That's when I understood. The inn wasn't just old, it was a trap. The figure, the whispers, the tapping, it was all part of it. Something wanted us to stay, to never leave. We packed up and left the next morning, the sun barely rising, the inn still silent. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The inn was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Just empty space, surrounded by trees. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that inn didn't want us to leave. And it might be waiting for the next people who wander too close. We rented a cabin in the mountains, tucked away far from civilization. The plan was simple: a weekend to disconnect, drink some beer, hike, and enjoy each other's company. Nothing out of the ordinary, but from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The cabin looked charming, old-fashioned but cozy, sitting quietly at the edge of a forest. But there was an eerie silence in the air. No birds, no animals, just the hum of the wind and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots as we unloaded the car. The first night was fine. We drank, joked, and set up a campfire. The woods were dark around us, but we didn't think much of it. By midnight, everyone had retreated to their rooms, and I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind was louder now, rattling the windows. I rolled over, trying to ignore the noise. That's when I heard it, a soft, distinct knock. It wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, unsure if I'd imagined it. I lay still, listening for more. It came again, tap, tap, tap. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just a branch tapping against the glass. But then came another noise, more unsettling, a slow dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the ground outside. I shot up, my breath shallow. The knocking had stopped, but the dragging sound continued, moving around the cabin, as though something or someone was circling us. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and I was too scared to go outside to check. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to the sound grow louder, closer. It was almost like it was testing the perimeter of the cabin, making its way around to each window. Then, everything stopped. The cabin went completely silent, and for a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the fear. The next morning, I didn't mention the sounds to my friends. We went hiking, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling from the night before. But the woods had an oppressive atmosphere, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. We made our way to a clearing, the sun barely breaking through the thick canopy above us. That's when I noticed something strange on the ground: footprints, but they were too big. The print was deep in the mud, almost like something heavy had stepped there, probably a bear, my friend Jake said, brushing it off. But something about it didn't sit right with me. We made our way back to the cabin, eager to relax after the hike. That's when I saw it. The window in the front room, the one I'd been so sure I'd locked last night, was wide open. I walked inside, my pulse quickening. We hadn't opened that window, and I definitely hadn't left it unlocked. I checked the others, but they were all fine. My heart raced as I walked into the living room. The furniture was in its usual place, but the air felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a dark shape standing just out of view, barely visible against the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I moved toward it, slowly, cautiously, but when I reached the spot, it was nothing. Just an old coat hanging on a hook. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. I was letting my imagination run wild. But that night, the knocking came again. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window. I looked out, my heart hammering in my chest, but saw nothing. No shadows, no figures, just the trees swaying in the wind. The knocking stopped. I wanted to forget about it. Maybe it was just the wind, or the cabin settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't tell anyone else about it. We packed up the next day and left, but as we drove away, something caught my eye. Just outside the woods, near the cabin, was a figure standing motionless, watching us leave. I blinked, and when I looked back, it was gone. Weeks later, I found something online. A news article about the area we had stayed in, a missing person case from 20 years ago. A couple had gone missing while camping there, and their bodies were never found. The article included a photo of the couple, and the thing that chilled me to the bone wasn't the tragedy, it was their faces. They looked exactly like us. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to leave that cabin. And maybe, just maybe, whatever was out there in the woods, knocking on our windows, wasn't finished with us. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of life. My friends and I rented an old cabin in the woods, remote, quiet, peaceful, or so we thought. We arrived just before sunset, the air thick with the smell of pine. The cabin was small but charming, nestled between towering trees, the kind of place you see in postcards. The first night, we gathered around the fireplace, chatting about everything and nothing, enjoying the crackling of the fire. The wind outside was gentle, almost soothing, and we settled in for a comfortable night. But as the evening wore on, something strange started happening. It was subtle at first, just a chill in the air that crept in even though the fire was blazing. Then there was the sound, a soft, scraping noise from somewhere deep in the house. It was faint at first, like nails on wood. I ignored it, attributing it to the old house settling. Then, the knock came. It was a soft tap on the door, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone stopped talking. We all glanced at the door, confused. The knocking continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. We were miles away from any neighbors. There was no way anyone could have wandered up here without us hearing them. We all got up and checked the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty woods. We laughed it off, assuming it was some odd sound from the house itself. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, but it wasn't the usual gusts of wind. It was unnaturally consistent, like something was pushing against the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang. It echoed through the cabin like someone had slammed a door somewhere. I immediately sat up, heart racing, and listened. The wind had stopped. Everything was eerily silent. Then, the same scraping sound started again, this time from just outside my room. I got up slowly, my feet heavy on the floorboards, trying not to make a sound. I peeked out through the small crack in my door. Nothing, just the dark hallway stretching out in front of me. But then, I saw a movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing still at the far end of the hall, half hidden in shadow. It was tall. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I stepped back into my room, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to shut out the fear. The next morning, the others didn't seem as rattled. We all pretended like nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been watching us. Later, that afternoon, we decided to take a hike to clear our heads. We walked through the woods, the trees whispering above us in the wind. As we returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was ajar wide open. We had locked it before we left. We rushed inside, but everything seemed normal. No sign of forced entry, nothing out of place. Just the same unsettling quiet that had followed us since the first night. But when I passed the hallway mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was something behind me, a shadow standing just out of view, its outline faint but unmistakable. I spun around. Nothing. I was alone. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? They wouldn't believe me. But that night, I stayed awake, watching every creak and groan of the house. The door remained locked, but I could feel it. Something was still out there, watching. We left the next morning, eager to put the cabin behind us. But when we returned home, I received a message from Mark. He had gone back to the cabin alone a week later to retrieve something he'd forgotten. When he went inside, everything seemed fine until he found something strange on the kitchen counter. There was a note. It read, "You were never supposed to leave." He never went back. To this day, I have no idea what was at that cabin. But I know one thing for sure, we weren't the only ones there. The sun had set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the campsite as I finished my rounds. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the woods at night, but something about this evening felt different. The air was thick, and the wind whispered through the branches like an ominous warning. It was late October, and the chill in the air hinted at winter's approach. I was on my way back to the main office when I heard a faint, desperate cry echoing through the woods. It was unlike any animal call I had ever heard. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. There it was, a chilling scream followed by a rustling in the bushes nearby. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight, turning toward the sound. I had always been taught to investigate, to help anyone in trouble. I began to walk slowly toward the noise, each step filled with uncertainty. As I moved deeper into the trees, the darkness enveloped me, and my flashlight beam flickered against the trunks. The scream came again, more frantic this time, urging me to hurry. I rounded a large oak and found myself at a small clearing. In the center was a campsite with a flickering fire, its warmth contrasting sharply with the chill in the air. I stepped closer, my heart racing as I called out to see if anyone was there. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. The campsite was empty, the tent still pitched, and the fire crackling quietly. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound behind me, a quick rustle of leaves, followed by an unmistakable growl. My breath hitched in my throat, and I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the dense tree line. I saw nothing, only the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I was about to turn back when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees, just beyond the light's reach. My heart raced as fear gripped me. I called out again, "Who's there?" "Show yourself." The growl came closer, a low rumble that reverberated in my chest. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I stepped cautiously toward the trees where I had seen the figure, every instinct telling me to turn back. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I spotted a flash of white, a shirt or a jacket vanishing deeper into the woods. I called after it, but there was only silence. Then, I noticed something on the ground, a child's teddy bear, its button eyes staring up at me, unblinking. My stomach twisted, a chill ran down my spine. Where had the child gone? Before I could dwell on the bear, the growl returned, this time much closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My flashlight flickered, and the beam caught something moving in the darkness. A large figure emerged from the shadows, its form grotesque and misshapen. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. It was a man, but not just any man. His limbs were elongated, and his skin appeared stretched over his bones. He grinned at me, revealing rows of jagged teeth, the moonlight glinting off them. He raised a hand as if to wave, but it was all wrong. I turned and ran, adrenaline propelling me through the trees. I could hear him behind me, his laughter echoing through the woods, sending ice through my veins. The path was familiar, but the fear twisted my perception. I raced past the empty campsite, barely glancing back, praying I could reach the main office. Just as I broke through the trees, I stumbled onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. I turned to look back, expecting to see the twisted figure closing in on me. But the woods were quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. The campsite remained untouched, the fire still crackling softly. I made it back to the office, heart pounding, ready to call for help. But as I reached for the door, I froze. In the office window stood a child, her face pale and expressionless. It was the same girl whose teddy bear I had found. She raised her hand and pointed at me, her finger tracing a line from my chest to her throat. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The man I had seen was not just a creature. He was a part of something much darker. I turned to run again, but the door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside with the specter of the forest's lost souls. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping. But as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone. Or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. The summer sun dipped low as we arrived at the campsite, a remote stretch of forest far from the buzz of civilization. I had always found solace in the woods, but something felt different this time. It was just me, Jenna, and Marcus' friends who were eager for a weekend of adventure, away from the constant hum of daily life. We set up our tents as the air cooled, and laughter filled the clearing as we roasted marshmallows by the fire. As darkness enveloped the forest, Jenna suggested we take a night hike. The idea sparked excitement, but I felt a twinge of hesitation. Still, the thrill of exploring the woods at night won out, and soon we were wandering deeper into the trees, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The forest was alive with sounds: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were boarded up. Intrigued, we approached cautiously. Marcus, ever the brave one, nudged the door, and to our surprise, it creaked open. A wave of unease washed over me, but my curiosity urged me forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jenna shone her flashlight around the room, illuminating faded photographs on the walls, images of families smiling, their eyes hauntingly empty. A sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, but I stayed, captivated by the strange energy that enveloped the cabin. We explored for a while, but as the shadows grew longer, we decided to head back to camp. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep in the woods. I froze, the sound crawling under my skin. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something menacing. We hurried back to the campsite, the fire crackling warmly as we huddled close. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I exchanged glances with Jenna and Marcus, silently acknowledging the unease that hung in the air. As the night wore on, I found it harder to shake the feeling of dread. I suggested we play a game to distract ourselves. We ended up telling ghost stories, our voices hushed as the tales grew darker. At one point, Marcus shared a legend He'd heard about a creature that roamed these woods, a spirit that took the form of a lost traveler, luring people into the forest never to return. Just as he finished, a loud crash echoed from the woods. My heart raced as we all jumped, flashlights flickering nervously in the direction of the sound. We strained to see, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged, illuminated briefly by our lights. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, wearing tattered clothes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with an unsettling intensity. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Help me, they're coming for me." We were frozen, the air thick with tension. I looked at Jenna and Marcus, both pale and wide-eyed. The man took a step closer, and in that moment, something shifted in the shadows behind him. More figures appeared, all with the same hollow eyes and tattered clothes. They emerged like wraiths from the darkness, their bodies flickering in and out of the light. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, we scrambled for the safety of the trees, hearts pounding in our chests. We ducked behind a large oak, breathless and terrified, as the figures advanced, their murmurs echoing through the night. I could feel the weight of their gaze, chilling and predatory. Then, just as we thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a voice whispering my name from the depths of the woods. It sounded just like Jenna. My stomach dropped. The growls returned, closer now, mingling with the whispers. Realizing we were being lured into the forest, I grabbed Jenna's arm and pulled her back. "We have to go," I shouted. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our escape, not stopping until we burst into the clearing where our campfire flickered in the darkness. We made it back to the tents, shaking and terrified, convinced we'd escaped whatever haunted those woods. As dawn broke, we packed our belongings in silence, the shadows of the night still looming large in our minds. Just before we left, I glanced back at the cabin. Its presence felt like a dark secret. There was a flash of movement in one of the windows, a face peering out, grinning wide. I blinked, and it was gone. We jumped into the car and drove away, vowing never to return, but the memories of that night would haunt us forever. Little did we know, we weren't the first to escape those woods, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. Last summer, my friends and I decided to escape the chaos of city life with a weekend camping trip in the wilderness. It was just me, Sarah, and Tom, excited to reconnect with nature. We picked a secluded spot by a picturesque lake, surrounded by tall pines and dense underbrush. The kind of place where you can hear the soothing sounds of water lapping at the shore. We arrived in the early afternoon, and setting up our tents, we spent the day hiking and swimming. As night fell, we lit a campfire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky transformed into a blanket of stars. It felt perfect until it didn't. As darkness enveloped us, the forest grew silent. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves vanished, replaced by unsettling stillness. The crackling of our campfire was the only sound we could hear. Sarah was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I paused, straining to listen. At first, I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, but then it came, a faint whispering carried by the wind. It sounded like distant voices, just beyond the reach of comprehension. Tom shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind playing tricks, but I felt a chill run down my spine. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, a low hum that seemed to surround us. It was as if the forest itself was alive, trying to communicate. The sounds twisted and turned, echoing through the trees, and soon, it felt like the whispers were getting closer. I glanced at Sarah, who looked just as unnerved as I felt. "Let's go check it out," I suggested, trying to mask my fear with bravado. Sarah and Tom exchanged hesitant glances, but eventually agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the darkness. Following the sound, the beam of my flashlight sliced through the thick darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush. The whispers were clearer now, though still unintelligible. They seemed to dance just beyond our line of sight, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't pinpoint their source. It was as if they were taunting us, leading us deeper into the woods. "Maybe we should turn back," Tom said, glancing nervously at the shadows. I could sense his discomfort, but curiosity propelled us forward. After all, it's just the wind, right? Just some rustling branches. Suddenly, The whispering stopped, plunging us into an eerie silence. We stood still, our breaths visible in the cold night air, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It was then that we realized we were completely disoriented. The trees looked unfamiliar, and the path we thought we were following had vanished. Panic bubbled up inside me, but I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "We need to retrace our steps," I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. We turned back, following the faintest memory of our previous trail. After what felt like an eternity, we finally stumbled back into the clearing where our campsite was. The campfire still flickered, casting a warm glow that felt welcoming. We collapsed onto the ground, relieved to be back, our hearts racing from the adrenaline and fear. The whispers had ceased, leaving us with a lingering unease. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, sharing stories to fill the silence. No one spoke about what we had heard in the woods, but the experience changed us. The next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees, still standing tall and silent, holding onto their secrets. I don't know what we experienced that night, but the whispers remain etched in my memory, a haunting reminder of the unknown that lurks just beyond the edge of the light. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me and my friends. We had all done it before, hiking into the woods and setting up camp for a night of storytelling, laughs, and maybe a few beers. But this time something felt different, like the air was thick with unease. We didn't know it yet, but our plans were about to change, and none of us would ever forget the night that followed. We arrived at the campgrounds just before dusk, and the sun was dipping behind the trees. The forest was dense, the kind of place where the shadows stretched long and the wind whispered through the branches. After unpacking and setting up the tents, we gathered around the campfire. Everything felt normal at first: the smell of roasting marshmallows, the crackling of the fire, the familiar banter between friends. But, as the night wore on, things started to shift. Around midnight, as we were telling ghost stories, we heard something strange. A twig snapped in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the dry leaves. It wasn't just one set of footsteps though, it sounded like two, maybe three. We all froze, straining to listen, but the forest was eerily silent again. At first, we joked about it, suggesting it was just a deer or some other animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We brushed it off and continued our conversation, but I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation in the back of my mind. The footsteps didn't stop. They just kept lingering, always out of reach. Around 2 a.m., we decided to go to bed. As we lay there in the dark, trying to get comfortable in the tents, I heard the rustling again. It wasn't far from us now, and the sound seemed almost deliberate, like someone was walking slowly, circling the camp. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing came. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. I tried to sleep, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Then, there was a loud crash from the edge of the campsite, followed by a low growl. I shot up, my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat. We all scrambled out of our tents, panic setting in. We gathered by the fire, looking around nervously. The growling came again, closer this time. It sounded like something large, but not quite an animal. It was too deep, too guttural. My friends were whispering in frantic voices, but I couldn't focus on what they were saying. My eyes were locked on the trees, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. That's when we saw the figures standing, just outside the firelight, silhouetted against the trees. They weren't moving, they were just standing there. At first, I thought they were other campers, but they didn't look right. Their shapes were off, too tall, their limbs unnaturally long. One of them tilted its head slowly toward us, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized they weren't human. They were something else. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the growling started again, louder now, almost like a warning. My friends were whispering urgently to each other, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from those figures. They didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. They just waited. We had no idea what to do. We weren't even sure if we should run or stay still. But then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished into the trees. We stood there, frozen, unsure if we were safe. The night seemed impossibly quiet, too quiet. I thought maybe it was over, that it had been a trick of the light, but I knew deep down that wasn't true. Something had been there with us, something we couldn't understand. We huddled together by the fire, our nerves shot, until morning came. The sun slowly crept over the horizon, dispelling the darkness and the terror we had felt. The forest seemed calm again, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. We quickly packed up our gear and left the campsite, none of us daring to speak of what we had seen. It wasn't until we returned home that I had a chance to look at the photos we'd taken that night. We had taken several shots around the campfire, mostly of us laughing and enjoying the night. But in the background of one photo, just behind the trees, there were two figures standing, just like the ones we had seen. But this time, they were clearer, and the worst part, they weren't just standing there, they were smiling. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stared at the photo. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting for us, and now, I don't think it's finished yet. I've been a park ranger for over a decade, so I've seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness. But nothing compares to the night I had to work alone at one of the most remote parts of the park. It was an area that most tourists avoided, known for its dense forest, treacherous trails, and deep, unnerving silence. That night, the silence was the least of my concerns. It started like any other late shift. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the trees. I had a routine to follow: check the trail markers, make sure the paths were clear, and inspect the camping areas. Simple tasks, but there was something unsettling about that evening. The air felt thick, and as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the usual sounds of the forest birds calling, leaves rustling seemed to vanish. Around 9 p.m., I made my way to a section of the park where we'd received reports of unusual activity. A few campers had mentioned hearing footsteps and strange whispers late at night. I wasn't concerned, we'd gotten reports like that before, and they usually turned out to be animals or the wind. But something about that particular night made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were footprints on the trail, fresh ones, but they weren't human. They were too large to spread apart. I followed them for a few minutes, the crunch of my boots the only sound breaking the quiet. The footprints led me to a clearing near a creek. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. At first, I thought it was another ranger, someone I hadn't met before. "Hey, you lost?" I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. I took a few cautious steps forward, but something told me to stop. The air around me grew colder, and my breath began to fog up, though it wasn't that cold yet. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal. It was something much deeper, more malevolent. My flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in my stomach. I called out again, this time more urgently, but no answer came. I had to get back to the station and report this. As I turned to leave the clearing, I noticed the footprints again, but they weren't where they had been. They were closer now, directly in front of me. The space between each step seemed to grow smaller. That's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't in any language I knew. It sounded like it was right behind me, but when I spun around, there was nothing. Just the forest, empty and still. I hurried back down the trail, keeping an eye on the path behind me. My heart was racing. The whispering continued, but now it sounded like it was coming from all directions, closing in on me. I stumbled, trying to maintain my composure, but the whispers grew louder. Then, the figure appeared again, this time in the middle of the trail. I froze. It wasn't just standing there now, it was moving toward me. Slowly, its limbs impossibly long. As it got closer, the air grew colder still, and my breath became more labored. The figure's face was still obscured, but its presence felt wrong. My body was telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The whispering stopped. In the stillness, I could hear something else now, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on bark. The sound came from the figure, and it was getting louder, faster, as if it were moving toward me at an accelerating pace. I snapped into motion. My legs finally worked, and I sprinted down the trail, not daring to look back. The tapping continued behind me, but I didn't dare stop or slow down. It wasn't until I reached the ranger station and locked myself inside that I dared to catch my breath. I spent the rest of the night in a panic, eyes darting to every shadow, every creak of the building. The next morning, I went back to the spot where I'd seen the figure. There were no footprints, nothing had been disturbed. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. On the bark of a nearby tree, carved into the wood, were words scratched in with the sharp object, "I'm still here. I didn't sleep that night. And I've never gone back to that part of the park alone." A few years ago, I went on a weekend getaway with some friends to a cabin deep in the woods. It was meant to be a relaxing retreat from the chaos of our daily lives. The place was remote, no cell service, no distractions, just a small, rustic cabin and the forest surrounding us. My friends were all excited, but I had a strange feeling as soon as we arrived. The cabin was old, the kind of place that creaked and groaned in the night, but the air felt thick, like it was holding something back. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking it was just nerves, but something wasn't right. We spent the day hiking and chatting around the campfire. The evening came, and we all gathered in the cabin, laughing and drinking. But around midnight, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy and quiet to quiet. No crickets, no breeze, just silence. I was sitting near the window when I noticed it, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the trees moving in the wind, but when I looked closer, I saw that it was still, and then it moved. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shadow was definitely there. It was a figure standing just outside the window, barely visible in the dark. My heart jumped, and I quickly looked away, trying to shake off the unease. But I couldn't. The others were oblivious, caught up in their conversation. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I heard a soft tap on the window. I froze. My friends continued talking, unaware, but the tap came again. Faint, slow, as if someone was gently knocking on the glass. I jumped up and pulled the curtains shut, my breath shallow. The others glanced at me, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound crazy. The tapping stopped after a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I tried to relax and join the conversation, but the quiet around the cabin was unsettling. Every now and then, I thought I heard something: footsteps, twigs breaking, soft whispers in the distance. I kept glancing out the window, but the darkness held nothing but the looming trees. When we decided to head to bed, I couldn't sleep. The sounds outside the cabin had grown louder. It was as if something was pacing around the house. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But then there was a knock, soft, at first, then louder. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the ceiling. My heart nearly stopped. The knock echoed through the cabin, like something or someone was in the attic. I had to check. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The knocking continued, methodical, like it was trying to get my attention. I gathered all the courage I had and crept up the stairs to the attic. The air was colder, and I could feel my skin prickle with every step. The door to the attic was ajar, just slightly. I slowly pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside was a dusty, empty space. But there, on the floor, was something that shouldn't have been there, a footprint. A muddy, human-sized footprint. I quickly stepped back and slammed the door shut. I couldn't explain it. I went back to my room and locked the door, not daring to go outside or tell anyone. It wasn't until the next morning that I told my friends about the sounds. They were skeptical at first, but then we checked the attic. There were more footprints, all around the space. They didn't look like they'd been there long, like someone had been walking around up there, moving things. We immediately decided to leave. We packed up and drove back to town. But as we were leaving the property, something made my blood run cold. The window, the same window where I'd seen the figure earlier. It was wide open. The lock was still in place, but the window had been opened from the inside. I can't explain it. The cabin was supposed to be empty when we arrived. There were no signs of anyone having been there before. but someone or something had been watching us the entire time, lurking just out of sight, waiting. We never went back to that cabin. I still have nightmares about the knocking, the footsteps, and that damn window. But the worst part, I still don't know who or what had been in that attic. The only thing I'm sure of is that it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a cabin in the woods with a few close friends. We were all looking for some peace, a chance to get away from work, from the noise, and from the constant pressure of daily life. None of us were particularly superstitious, and we didn't believe in ghost stories or strange happenings. We just wanted to disconnect and relax. We arrived at the cabin late in the evening. The weather was perfect, a bit cool with a soft breeze. The cabin was older, rustic in a charming way, but the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. The air inside was too still, too quiet. Even as we set up the fire and cracked open a few beers, there was an uncomfortable heaviness to the place. I shrugged it off. After all, it was just the setting. Nature has a way of making you feel like you're not alone. We went to bed around midnight, and I couldn't help but notice that the silence outside was absolute. No wind, no animals, nothing. I've never been fond of the dark, but I tried to push away that creeping feeling that we weren't really alone here. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard it scratching. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, trying to get into the cabin. But the scratching continued, rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't the usual animal scurrying. It sounded like something dragging against the wood, slow and methodical. I sat up, heart racing. The noise stopped. I waited, listening. Then came a tap at my window, a soft, distinct tap. I was frozen in place, staring at the dark outline of the window. Another tap. I got out of bed, trying to tell myself it was just an animal, but a nagging feeling tugged at me. I slowly crept to the window, pulled back the curtain, and looked outside. Nothing. I exhaled, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a branch. But as I turned to head back to bed, I heard it again, a whisper. My name, soft but clear. I froze in my tracks, my blood turning cold. I turned back to the window and pressed my forehead against the glass. This time, I could see something movement just beyond the tree line. A shadow, darker than the night around it, moving slowly in our direction. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of something tall and thin, swaying unnaturally. My heart was in my throat, and I knew I had to wake the others, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing standing there in the darkness, barely visible, yet undeniably real. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape vanished. I rushed to the door, but before I could open it, I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking toward me. I ran to the others' rooms, banging on the doors. They woke up gradually, confused, but I couldn't explain what I had seen. It didn't make sense. But I wasn't going to be the one to stay alone in that room. We all gathered in the living room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. That's when we heard the scraping sound, coming from the walls, as though someone was dragging something sharp along the wood. The house creaked, and the sound grew louder, closer. One of my friends, James, went to check the back door. He stopped short as he reached for the knob. His face went pale. The door had been scratched, deep grooves dug into the wood, as if something had been clawing at it for hours. The strangest part, the scratches were fresh. There was no way any animal could have done that. We bolted. We grabbed our things, ran to the car, and sped away. As we left the cabin behind, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights of the cabin were dimming. But before they went out completely, I swear I saw a figure standing in the window, tall, dark, and watching us leave. When we got back to civilization, we went online to search for any mention of the cabin. To my horror, there was an article about the place. The cabin had been abandoned for years after a family disappeared there in the early 80s. The article mentioned strange scratching sounds heard by neighbors, and the last line of the piece sent chills down my spine. Some say they still hear footsteps in the woods at night. We were lucky. We all made it out, but every time I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing louder behind me. We weren't the type to go to haunted places. It wasn't that we didn't believe in ghosts. It was just that none of us wanted to test it out. But when we saw the ad for a weekend getaway at a supposedly haunted house, we thought it would be fun. Just a harmless thrill, a way to break up the monotony. The house was old, much older than we expected. The kind of place where the floorboards creaked under every step and the air smelled faintly of mildew. We arrived late on a Friday evening, the sun already down, and the house seemed to greet us with an eerie silence. The first few hours were fine. We joked about the house's creepy reputation, settled into our rooms, and started a game of cards in the living room. But, as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Around midnight, we heard it. A thudding noise coming from the upstairs. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but the sound grew louder. There was no one else in the house, no one but us. We all paused, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time running down the hallway. I was ready to laugh it off, but something stopped me. It was too deliberate. I suggested we check it out. My friends hesitated, but curiosity got the best of them. We tiptoed up the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. The hallway upstairs was dark, but we could see the door to one of the rooms open a crack, just enough to feel like something was watching us. Then the thud came again, closer this time. It was coming from the open room. We didn't dare move. The noise stopped. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, frozen. And then, a voice, faint and raspy, came from the room. "Leave." The sound sent a chill down my spine. We all backed away, but then the door slammed shut by itself, as if something inside didn't want us near. I don't think any of us slept that night. The air was too thick with unease. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like it was watching us. We could hear whispers from the other rooms, distant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Morning came, but the strange feelings didn't go away. We tried to forget about it, to shrug it off as just a prank or our imagination running wild, but something about that place still unsettled us. After breakfast, we decided to explore the house. We went into the attic, hoping to find something to distract us. The stairs creaked under our feet as we made our way up. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes, but there was something strange about the far corner. A large mirror, covered in dust, stood there, reflecting only the dim light from our flashlights. We wiped the dust off and stared into it. The reflection was odd, fuzzy, blurry, like the mirror couldn't quite capture the room right. Then it shifted. For a brief moment, it looked like the room behind us wasn't the attic at all. It was a hallway, with the same door we'd seen earlier, the one that slammed shut. But it wasn't just that. There was something else in the reflection, standing in the hallway. A figure, a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was obscured, but his posture was unnerving, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though he was staring directly at us. I gasped and turned around. There was nothing behind us, just the dusty attic. We all felt it, then a cold wave of dread. The temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers returned, now louder, more urgent. We didn't waste any time. We hurried down the stairs and out of the house, our nerves frayed, but as we were leaving, something caught my eye. It was a small piece of paper tucked under the door. I picked it up, feeling a strange sensation in my fingers as I unfolded it. The message was simple, written in jagged handwriting. "Don't look in the mirror." I nearly dropped it. My hands shook as I showed it to the others. We all stared at each other, too terrified to speak. We didn't stay another minute. We packed up and left, not daring to look back. The drive home was quiet, everyone too shaken to talk. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I froze. For a brief second, I saw the same reflection in the glass, the tall figure, standing behind me, its face still hidden. The figure was in the mirror again. But this time, it wasn't the old house, it was our car, and the figure was standing just inches from my seat. That's when I realized. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It had followed us. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a simple hike with a couple of friends. We were looking for a secluded spot to camp, a place where we could escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. It wasn't even supposed to be an overnight trip, but that night changed everything. We started out in the late afternoon, taking a trail that had been described to us as off the beaten path by some locals. It was supposed to be an easy trek, Just a few hours to a nice, quiet clearing by a stream where we could set up camp and spend the evening. The air was crisp, the sky still clear, and everything felt perfect at least. For the first couple of hours, as we made our way deeper into the woods, we noticed something strange. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. I assumed it was just the stillness of the forest, but the longer we walked, the more unnerving it became. Even the wind had died down. The silence felt oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made your skin tingle and your senses go on high alert, as though something was watching you. We set up camp around dusk. A small fire crackled in the middle of the clearing, and we sat around it, trying to shake off the growing unease. We didn't talk much, which felt odd for a group of friends who usually couldn't stop chatting. The quiet was heavy. Then we heard it, a voice. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. Help? It came from somewhere beyond the trees, just barely audible. At first, we thought it was a trick of the wind, but it was too clear, too real. We all froze. I looked around at my friends, trying to gauge their reactions. They were just as unnerved as I was. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, one of them replied. What the hell was that? We all stood up, eyes darting around the campfire, trying to make sense of it. The voice came again, this time louder. Help me. The words were desperate, frantic, almost pleading. Without thinking, we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the source of the sound. I don't know why we didn't stop. It didn't make sense. It was dark, we were in the middle of nowhere, and the voice sounded wrong, almost like it was coming from something not human. But we went anyway. The woods around us grew darker the deeper we went, the trees closing in. The air became thick, the chill biting at our skin. We followed the voice for what felt like an eternity, but it never seemed to get any closer. It was as if we were chasing a ghost, the sound shifting and moving, just out of reach. Then, we found it. A small clearing, barely big enough for all of us to stand in. At the center of it was a pile of rocks, and on top of the rocks was a crude carving, a symbol I didn't recognize, something old and unsettling. The voice stopped. We all stood there, staring at the rocks, unsure of what to do next. The silence felt suffocating. Then, we heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the distance. It was right behind us. Help me. The voice was now right next to me, close enough that I could feel the cold breath against my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but darkness. My friends were in the same state of panic, spinning in circles, their flashlights flickering wildly. We didn't know what to do. Every instinct told us to run, but the path back was already obscured by the shadows. That's when I noticed it, a shadow. A figure, standing just outside the circle of our lights, barely visible but unmistakable. I stepped toward it, my heart racing. The other shouted for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I took another step forward, and the figure moved. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a black silhouette. No distinct features, just an outline that seemed to shift with the light. And then, it spoke again, but this time, it wasn't a plea for help. Leave. The voice was deep and unnatural, reverberating in my chest like a thunderclap. My friends screamed and pulled me back, dragging me away from the figure. We stumbled back through the trees, terrified and confused, not daring to look behind us. The forest seemed to open up before us, like the path had been waiting. When we made it back to the clearing where we had set up camp, the fire was out. The tents were gone, completely vanished. Everything was still, but not in the same way as before. It was a stillness that felt empty, like the forest had swallowed us whole and left nothing but the echo of our fear. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what we saw, or who or what had been calling us. But there's one thing I know for sure. The figure wasn't the thing we were supposed to fear. It wasn't the thing that wanted us to leave. It was the thing that wanted us to stay. We had planned a camping trip for weeks, a group of 5 friends eager to escape the noise of our daily lives and spend a few days in the woods. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, some hiking, a little fishing, and long nights by the campfire telling stories. Nothing fancy, just the quiet of nature and the company of close friends. But that night, something changed. We arrived at the site just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The camp was tucked away in a secluded corner of the forest, miles from the nearest town. The air felt fresh, almost unnervingly so, but we were used to that. After setting up the tents and starting the campfire, we cracked open some beers and settled in. We joked and laughed as the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced on the trees around us. As the night wore on, the forest grew still. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of small creatures had fallen silent, replaced by an oppressive quiet. It was the kind of silence that crawls under your skin, making every little noise seem louder, sharper. I noticed at first, a small sound, barely perceptible, like something brushing against the leaves. I thought it was nothing at first, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the others had caught it too. I looked over at my friend Max. He had his hand on his flashlight, his knuckles white. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all froze, straining to listen. A branch snapped somewhere deep in the woods. Then nothing. A cold shiver crept down my spine. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. She wasn't fooling anyone. We sat in uneasy silence, staring into the fire, every one of us too nervous to speak. Then came the first scream. It was high-pitched, not the kind of scream you hear when someone's hurt, but the kind that chills your blood. A distant scream, like a woman's voice. The sound carried through the trees and stopped abruptly. We jumped to our feet, hearts racing. Max was already reaching for his backpack, fumbling for the map, his face pale. "Maybe it's someone else camping out here," he said, though none of us believed him. That scream was too loud, too close. I whispered. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was thin, almost like I was trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Without thinking, we grabbed flashlights and headed toward the source of the sound. The trees were thick, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift unnaturally as we walked. Each step felt heavier, like the forest itself was resisting us. The scream came again, closer this time. A horrible, shrieking wail that tore through the air. We broke into a run, pushing through the underbrush, our breaths ragged, and then we saw it, a figure, hunched over by a tree, facing away from us. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms too long. It was scraping something on the ground, a slow, rhythmic motion that sent a fresh wave of dread through us. "Hello." Max called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. We took a step closer, the tension thick in the air. That's when the creature turned. Its face was hollow, its eyes wide and unblinking, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. A grin stretched across its face, impossibly wide, showing teeth that weren't just sharp, they were jagged, like they had been ripped from something not human. My stomach lurched. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Without warning, the thing opened its mouth and screamed again, this time so close it felt like it was inside my head. The scream was so loud, so pure in its terror, that it sent us stumbling backward. We turned and ran without looking back. The next few minutes were a blur of movement, fear, and adrenaline. We finally reached the camp, all of us panting, shaking, and covered in dirt. We didn't stop to think. We just threw ourselves into the tents, locking everything up as quickly as we could. The fire had burned low, the shadows growing longer and more ominous by the second. We huddled together, our breaths shallow, but the forest was silent again. Not a single sound. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in our tents trying to recover from the shock, that I noticed something strange. Max had the map in his hands, staring at it with a puzzled look on his face. I leaned over, trying to see what he was looking at. There, on the map, was our campsite, but it was marked with an X, a circle around it, and a single word scrawled next to it. Dead. The air grew even colder. I could feel the blood drain from my face. The map had been in Max's backpack the entire time. We hadn't touched it since we set up camp. It shouldn't have been marked like that. We weren't alone. Not just in the forest. Somewhere, out there, in the trees, there was something else. Something that had been waiting. It was late in the afternoon, and the park was starting to empty out. Most visitors had left for the day, and I was finishing up some paperwork in the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. There was a report of a strange sighting near one of the old trails, a popular spot, but not heavily trafficked. No one had gone out there in weeks. so the call struck me as odd. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out, thinking it was probably just someone messing around. The air was crisp, and a thick mist had rolled in from the valley, making the trees look like towering shadows. The sun was setting fast, and the forest had a quiet, unnerving stillness to it. I made my way along the trail, the light from my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the path. The deeper I went, the more the mist seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Every twig that cracked underfoot sounded too loud, too unnatural. I paused a moment, listening for anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard an unmistakable noise. A child's laughter. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and clear. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching. There hadn't been any kids on the trail that day. And this wasn't the kind of sound you would expect to hear in the middle of the woods at dusk. The laughter was faint, almost playful, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like a normal laugh. It sounded hollow, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to brush it off, but then it came again, closer this time. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. No response. Only the laughter. Louder now, taunting and echoing through the trees. I hesitated, but I knew I had to investigate. I wasn't about to leave the woods in the dark without figuring out what was going on. I followed the sound deeper into the mist. The trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to grow taller and closer, casting dark shadows over the path. The laughter continued, now mixed with strange, choppy breathing, like someone was struggling to speak. The hair on my arm stood on end. I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There, standing at the edge of the path, was a figure, a little girl. She was dressed in an old-fashioned, frilly white dress that looked out of place for the woods. Her hair was long and tangled, falling over her face so I couldn't see her eyes. She was facing away from me, just standing there, perfectly still. My heart started to race, and the laughter stopped. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to step forward, calling out to her, "Hey, are you lost? Are you okay?" She didn't move. I took another step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The moment my beam hit her head jerked up sharply. The face that met me was not that of a child. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that was far too large for any human face. I stumbled back, the light flashing wildly around the trees. Suddenly, the mist shifted and parted in a way that felt unnatural, revealing a massive shape behind her. A shadow so large and dark it swallowed up everything around it. It was moving, slowly, like it was testing its weight with each step. I could barely make out a shape, something monstrous, towering over the little girl. It was like a large, misshapen figure, too blurry to be fully understood, but I could feel its presence in every bone of my body. The laughter came back, but now it was frantic, echoing from all directions. "Run!" I yelled at the girl, though I knew she wouldn't move. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back the way I came, my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, but I could hear the sound of something heavy moving behind me, the ground shaking with every step. I finally broke through the mist and back onto the main trail. The air felt suddenly lighter, and the world seemed normal again, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, panting, looking around. No towering figure, no girl, no strange laughter. Just the normal sounds of the forest at night. It wasn't until I got back to the ranger station that I noticed it on the back of my neck. Just under my jacket collar was something damp. I reached up and pulled it off, and in my hand was a small tuft of hair, but it wasn't mine. Working as a park ranger can be peaceful. The endless expanse of forest, the fresh air, and the solitude make it feel like you're part of something ancient. But there are nights I wish I could forget. Nights like the one I'm about to tell you. It started with a routine call late in the evening. A camper reported strange noises near the eastern edge of the park, deep in the woods. Normally, I'd write it off as wildlife. Foxes or coyotes can make sounds that send chills down your spine. But the urgency in his voice made me take it seriously. He said he'd seen someone or something lurking near his tent. He refused to stay the night. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and the keys to the Jeep, and set out toward the eastern trail. The park was vast, and the trails were isolated. It would take me about an hour to reach the site. The drive was uneventful, but as I got closer, I noticed the forest felt unusually still. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I found the campsite easily enough. The camper was gone, his gear hastily packed up, but nothing seemed out of place. I radioed back to the station to let them know I'd arrived and began walking the perimeter, looking for tracks or signs of an animal. That's when I saw them footprints. Human, but wrong. The prints were elongated, the toes splayed out in a way that didn't look natural. They led away from the site and into the woods. My instincts told me to turn back, but protocol was protocol. I had to investigate. I followed the trail, shining my flashlight ahead. The beam illuminated the twisted branches and the uneven terrain, but nothing else. The prints continued deeper into the forest, eventually veering toward a dense thicket. I hesitated. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, pushing through the brush. I came across something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt was an old, rusted lantern, the glass shattered. It looked decades old, far too weathered to have belonged to the camper. Nearby, the footprints stopped abruptly, no sign of where they led, no indication of a struggle, just silence. A faint noise broke the stillness, a low, guttural moan. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the trees. My breath quickened, and I gripped the light tighter. The moan came again, louder this time, followed by a snapping sound, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. My radio crackled to life, startling me. It was static at first, but then I heard a voice, faint and distorted. It wasn't one of my co-workers. The voice repeated the same phrase, over and over, "Get out now, get out now." My blood ran cold. I spun around, shining the light in every direction, but there was nothing, only the towering trees and the oppressive darkness. The radio fell silent again. I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was out here wasn't something I could handle alone. I turned to head back to the Jeep, but as I stepped out of the thicket, I froze. Standing in the path, just outside the reach of my flashlight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. My heart pounded as I slowly backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hands. The beam flickered, and for a moment, the figure disappeared. When the light steadied, it was closer. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, but I managed to stay upright. The figure didn't advance any further. It simply stood there, its head tilted slightly, as if observing me. The air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait. I ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back to the campsite. When I reached the Jeep, I threw myself inside, locking the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine. I didn't look back. The next morning, I returned with the team. The campsite was empty, just as I'd left it. But when we reached the thicket, there was no sign of the footprints, no lantern, no figure. It was as if none of it had happened. My coworkers thought I'd imagined it, that maybe exhaustion had gotten the better of me. But I know what I saw. A week later, I found something tucked under the seat of my Jeep. An old, rusted lantern, the glass shattered, just like the one in the woods. I keep it locked in a cabinet at the station. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint moan coming from inside. I try not to think about what it means. It was supposed to be a typical weekend getaway, just a small group of us venturing into the woods for a peaceful hike. We were far from the usual trails, deep into an area that was barely touched by anyone, with dense trees and the kind of silence that felt unnatural. We set up camp near an old, forgotten trail, with nothing but a few old maps to guide us. The sun dipped low as we built our fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across the clearing. We didn't know it then, but that night would change everything. By the time we finished dinner, the sky was completely dark. The fire crackled, and we sat around it, sharing stories, laughing, and enjoying the isolation. As the night wore on, the woods seemed to grow quieter, heavier. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had stopped. All that remained was the sound of our voices, which now seemed to loud against the oppressive silence. At one point, I stepped away from the fire to relieve myself. The forest was so dark that even with the flashlight, the trees seemed to swallow the light whole. As I made my way through the brush, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a sense of being watched, but I told myself it was just the isolation. When I finished and turned back toward the camp, I heard a noise. It was a soft scraping, like something dragging along the ground. My heart skipped. I shone my light around, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I quickly made my way back to the fire. When I returned, everyone was still talking, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. The laughter had stopped, and everyone seemed to be glancing nervously toward the woods. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the dark messing with our minds. But then we heard it, a rustling, deeper in the woods than any animal could have made. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer, this was something far heavier, something that wasn't moving in the usual way. My stomach tightened as we all turned toward the sound, eyes wide. Probably just a bear, one of my friends said, but his voice was shaky. We waited, frozen, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The air felt colder suddenly, and my breath fogged in front of me. The noise stopped, and everything went dead quiet again. Then came the voice. It wasn't a growl or a screech, but a soft, guttural whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, low enough to be barely audible. Leave. My blood ran cold. The others hadn't heard it. They were still looking at the trees, trying to figure out what had made the noise. I felt a cold hand wrap around my spine. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and turned to shine it in the direction of the voice. And I saw it, a figure, barely discernible in the shadows. It was tall and unnaturally still. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, unable to move. I could see nothing but the silhouette, but the feeling it gave off was suffocating. It was staring right at me, its face hidden in the dark. I didn't know what to do. The others were still oblivious, talking amongst themselves, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching. I backed up slowly, moving toward the fire. It wasn't until I had nearly reached the circle of light that it disappeared, slipping back into the woods like smoke. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. The rest of the night was a blur. We sat around the fire in silence, no one daring to speak about what had happened. I didn't want to mention what I saw, afraid I'd sound crazy. But the unease lingered, and as the fire burned low, we decided to go to sleep. Though no one slept well, the next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave. As we broke down camp, one of my friends stumbled upon something strange, a large, twisted piece of bark. It was fresh, not from the forest around us. But what made it worse was the carving. It was the same symbol we'd seen the night before. A figure, tall, watching. We left immediately after that. No one spoke of it again. But, as we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the edge of the woods, barely visible in the trees, was the figure, watching. We all saw it this time. And that was when I realized it wasn't something that had been in the woods at all. It had followed us back. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and my 3 friends. We packed up the tents, camping gear, and enough snacks to last the weekend. We drove out to a secluded spot deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town to escape the noise of civilization. I wasn't particularly excited about the isolation, but the others were eager to disconnect from everything for a while, and I went along with it. We arrived just before dusk, setting up our camp near a small, murky lake. The evening air was crisp, and the sky slowly darkened as we sat around the fire, cracking jokes and roasting marshmallows. There was something eerie about the place, though. The woods seemed quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I didn't mention it to the others, didn't want to ruin the mood, but something didn't feel right. As the night wore on, we heard a few odd noises from the trees, branches creaking, leaves rustling. Nothing alarming, but it was enough to make me uneasy. We chalked it up to wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the campsite. Every now and then, I'd glance around, half expecting to see someone or something just beyond the tree line. But there was nothing there. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. My friend Darren and I were sharing a tent, and the other two had their own. I lay there in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Then, suddenly, I heard it a loud, sharp crack, like something heavy breaking. I sat up, heart pounding, and turned to Darren. "Did you hear that?" He gradually nodded. "Yeah, probably a branch or something, but I wasn't so sure. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't natural. It was too sharp, too deliberate." I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just spooked. But as I lay back down, I heard something else, faint whispering, coming from just outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The whispering grew louder, but it wasn't in any language I could understand. The words were muffled, as if spoken through a veil of thick fabric. I wasn't about to get out and check. I nudged Darren, but he was asleep, snoring lightly. The whispering continued, now accompanied by soft, shuffling footsteps, like someone walking around the tent. I could feel my pulse racing, my body paralyzed with fear. My hand fumbled for the flashlight, but I couldn't find it in the dark. I didn't dare to speak, didn't dare to move. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and I heard a low, guttural breathing, right outside the tent. It was deep, labored, like someone or something was struggling to catch its breath. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, like my voice had been stolen. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The woods were silent again. I waited a few minutes, heart thudding in my chest, before I finally mustered the courage to peek out of the tent. I unzipped the door just a crack. I scanning the dark, empty campsite. Nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief and pulled the zipper back down. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I don't think I slept a wink, but somehow, the morning light eventually crept through the trees, and I could finally relax. At breakfast, I tried to act normal, like nothing had happened. But Darren wasn't so nonchalant. He'd been awake too, and he had heard the whispers too. He didn't know what to make of it, but he wasn't willing to stay another night to find out. We packed up our things early and started hiking back to the car. As we walked through the woods, something caught my eye, a strange, twisted tree just off the trail. The bark was peeling away in long strips, revealing something underneath, something dark and smooth, almost like stone. As I approached, I saw it more clearly. There were symbols carved into the bark, crude and jagged, as if someone had done it in a hurry. I shivered, feeling the hairs on my neck rise again. We kept walking, trying not to linger too long, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. Finally, we reached the clearing where we'd parked the car. I was relieved, ready to leave that place behind. But, as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I heard something else, soft tapping, like fingers on glass. I turned, and my stomach dropped. It was coming from the windows of the car, but no one was inside. No one had been inside all morning. I ran over and peered through the window, trying to see through the foggy glass. And there, staring back at me from the other side, was my own reflection grinning. My mouth was open in a wide, toothy smile, and my eyes were wild, unblinking, but I wasn't smiling. I froze, staring into the glass as my reflection seemed to shift, its grin widening impossibly, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You should have stayed." We had been planning the camping trip for weeks. There were 6 of us, 2 couples, and my best friend Mike. We all piled into a small van with tents, sleeping bags, and gear. It was early autumn, and the woods were stunning, full of vibrant colors, crisp air, and that perfect silence you only find miles from civilization. The drive was long, but we finally reached the spot. The forest was dense, the trees thick with the weight of the season. The ground was soft beneath our boots as we set up camp in a clearing near a small creek. We were far enough away from other campsites that it felt private, isolated, perfect. After an easy dinner of hot dogs and marshmallows, we settled by the fire, the crackling wood warming our faces. It started around midnight. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves. Then I realized the sound was too rhythmic, almost like footsteps, soft but deliberate. The others didn't seem to notice. They were lost in conversation, laughing about something dumb Mike had said. But the footsteps grew louder, too close. I stood up, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The forest was too still, the firelight too dim. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking a bit. "Did you hear that?" Everyone stopped talking. There was only silence for a moment, then a twig snapped from the woods just beyond the firelight. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over at Mike, whose face was suddenly tight with tension. He was always the skeptic, the one who dismissed my fears, "Probably a deer or something," he muttered, but he didn't sound so sure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We sat in tense silence, the fire flickering and the darkness pressing in around us. After a while, the footsteps stopped, the tension hung in the air like a fog. We laughed it off, but I could still feel that someone, or something, was out there. Around 2 a.m., we decided to turn in. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the fire was dying down. I settled into my tent, trying to push aside the unease. Mike was already snoring in his tent across from mine. The others were quiet, but I couldn't fall asleep. My mind kept replaying the sounds I'd heard. That rhythmic, deliberate step. It had sounded to human. I heard it again, just as I was starting to drift off. A soft step, then another, and then crunch. A heavy footfall much closer this time. My heart slammed in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight, hesitating, then unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. There was nothing, only the dark outline of trees. The creek, trickling in the distance. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The ground felt unnervingly soft under my boots as I walked toward the tree line, flashlight in hand. Then I saw a figure in the distance, just beyond the edge of the firelight, a shadow. Standing still. "Hey," I called, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, my legs shaking. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trunks of the trees. "Hello," I called again. A rustling came from the bushes beside me. My heart raced as I turned toward it, but before I could react, something gripped my arm. I whipped around, flashlight catching Mike standing there. He looked terrified. "Don't," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not a person." "What?" I asked, confusion washing over me. "Just get back to the fire. Now." I pulled away from his grip, still unsure, but his face was pale and shaking. We turned and hurried back to the camp, not daring to look behind us. As we reached the fire, the others were standing up, looking nervous. Mike yanked his tent shut and grabbed his knife. "I don't know what's out there," he said, eyes wide. "But it's not a person." We sat in silence, the fire casting long, ghostly shadows on the trees. The night dragged on, each of us listening intently to the woods around us, but nothing happened. We stayed up, taking turns on watch, the hours ticking by. It wasn't until dawn that we finally let ourselves relax. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. By late afternoon, we packed up our camp, ready to leave. As we were gathering our things, I found something odd. One of our tents, the one closest to the tree line, had been slashed open along the side. No one had touched it, and we had all been accounted for the whole time. But what was even stranger was what I found lying on the ground near the terrace mall, withered notebook. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange, almost frantic writing, notes about the woods, sketches of trees, and at the very end, a single sentence: "You never leave. Not if they want you to stay." My blood ran cold. We weren't alone in those woods, but the thing that really chilled me to the core, the writing was in Mike's handwriting. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of 4: Yana, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yana suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray. Tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. What happened? Aaron stammered, his face pale. But the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. We decided to go camping one late summer evening, a spontaneous trip to escape the city. It was just a couple of friends and me, eager to unwind under the stars. We arrived at a secluded area in the woods, far from the main trails, where the trees loomed tall and thick, creating a natural canopy. As night fell, we set up our tents and built a fire, the crackling warmth contrasting with the encroaching chill of the forest. After some time, as the stars began to flicker into view, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Yena suggested a nighttime hike to explore the area. Matt and Aaron agreed, their eyes glinting with the excitement of adventure. I hesitated but eventually joined, feeling the thrill of the unknown pulling me along. Equipped with flashlights, we wandered deeper into the woods. The darkness enveloped us, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching on the twigs and leaves. The light from our flashlights danced erratically among the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker and dart away as we moved. It was all fun and games until we stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight spilled into the space, illuminating what looked like an old, decrepit campsite. The remnants of a fire pit sat overgrown with weeds, and the scattered remains of a few broken chairs were half buried in the earth. Suddenly, we heard a faint rustling sound coming from the trees at the edge of the clearing. We all froze, straining to listen. It was followed by a soft, rhythmic clanking, like chains being dragged across the ground. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their expressions mirroring my own fear. It felt as if the forest itself held its breath. Without speaking, we edged closer together, our flashlights illuminating the surrounding trees. Then, through the shadows, we saw them, figures shrouded in darkness, their forms obscured by the underbrush. They wore ragged clothing and seemed to move in unison, stepping into the clearing like they were part of the very shadows themselves. Each figure carried a lantern, the flickering light revealing glimpses of gaunt faces hidden behind tattered masks. They appeared almost ghostly, chained together, their movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged within us, and we ducked behind a tree, the bark rough against my back as I pressed into the wood. I could hear the clanking of chains growing louder as the figures approached, their lanterns swinging gently as if they were searching for something or someone. They moved closer to our hiding spot, the light from their lanterns illuminating the ground around us. My breath quickened, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. Then, just as one of them stopped, the lantern light shining directly on our tree, I stifled a gasp. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Then, as quickly as they had come, the figures turned and continued deeper into the woods. The sound of chains faded into the distance. We waited in silence, hearts pounding, unsure of what to do next. After several minutes, we finally dared to move, creeping back to our campsite, but what we found left us frozen in horror. Our tents were upturned, the fire pit was filled with embers, and the ground was marked with deep scratches, as if something had clawed at the earth. But the most chilling sight was the message scrawled in the dirt near our fire pit: "We will find you." I felt my stomach drop as dread settled in. We scrambled to gather our things, adrenaline propelling us forward. The forest felt alive, the trees watching as we hurriedly packed. The cool air turned frigid, and I could hear the rustling again, closer this time. In a frenzy, we piled into the car, the engine roaring to life as we drove away. We didn't stop until we were miles down the road, the forest fading into the distance. Later, we would tell ourselves it was just a trick of the mind, the wildness of the woods playing games with us. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint clinking of chains echoing in my memory. What still chills me the most is the thought that those figures might still be out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers, the lanterns glowing in the dark, and I wonder if they'll ever find us again. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy. Frozen in place, I watched as they danced around the fire. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves, eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed. The night was deeper than usual, the kind of darkness that feels like it has weight. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights in the woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring campers were safe. But this evening felt different. A chill ran through the air, making my skin prickle. The trees loomed above me like ancient giants, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes against the moonlight. Earlier in the day, a family had set up camp near the lake. They were a cheerful group, chatting and laughing as they roasted marshmallows. I'd stopped to make sure they were aware of the park's safety rules, especially about keeping food secure from wildlife. Little did I know that this simple encounter would haunt me. As darkness enveloped the forest, I began my usual rounds. The sounds of the woods were all too familiar: the rustling leaves, the distant hoots of owls, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. But then, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. A woman's scream echoed through the trees. It was raw and desperate, cutting through the tranquil night like a knife. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the lake, the screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made my stomach drop. The family's campfire still flickered in the distance, but their voices were gone. I reached their campsite, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the area, searching for any sign of them. The tent stood undisturbed, but the air felt wrong. I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Panic set in as I turned to check the trail leading away from the lake. That's when I saw a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to catch a clear glimpse. My instinct screamed for me to run, but I had a duty to protect these campers. I had to find them. I moved cautiously along the path, my flashlight illuminating the foliage as I pushed deeper into the woods. The darkness felt alive, closing in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting. Just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing. There, at the center, was a large figure crouched low, its back to me. I froze, my breath hitching. The figure was wearing something that resembled a tattered shirt, and I could see matted hair hanging down its back. My mind raced with horror stories of what could lurk in the depths of the forest. I stepped back slowly, but the sound of my movement caught its attention. The figure turned, and my blood ran cold. Its face was grotesque, a twisted mockery of a human. Eyes wide and bulging, It opened its mouth in a silent scream. A wave of terror washed over me, and I turned to flee. I sprinted back toward the camp, adrenaline pushing me forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, something lurking just out of sight. When I reached the campsite, I found the family emerging from the woods, faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked as if they had seen a ghost. I rushed to them, relief flooding through me. But before I could ask if they were okay, the mother spoke, her voice trembling. She said they had heard whispers in the trees, voices calling to them in the dark. Then, before I could process what she was saying, I caught a glimpse of the figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. I turned to the family, urging them to pack their things quickly. We needed to leave. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, but the signal was weak and crackling. Just as the family hastily packed their gear, I felt a sudden, icy breath on my neck. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the dark. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered like a heavy fog. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and the force seemed to whisper around us. Stop. We managed to get everything packed, and I led them away from the lake, my heart racing. I kept glancing back, half expecting the figure to reappear. When we reached the main road, I finally exhaled, the tension slowly lifting. But as I turned to reassure the family, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They were smiling, their eyes unblinking and vacant. They weren't scared at all. In fact, they seemed utterly calm, as if nothing had happened. My heart raced again, but for a different reason. I stepped back, confusion taking over. They weren't the same people I had spoken to earlier. The woman tilted her head, her grin widening, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come looking for us." The forest felt alive around me, pulsing with something dark and sinister. I stumbled backward, realizing that the woods had claimed them as its own. As I turned to run, the laughter of the family echoed behind me, a haunting reminder of what had happened in those deep woods. The night had settled in the forest like a heavy blanket, and as a park ranger, I was used to the eerie calm that enveloped the woods after sunset. The campgrounds were closed for the season, but I had to make my rounds to ensure no one had sneaked in for an illicit camping trip. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost deafening. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted branches and underbrush. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual: a tent set up deep in the woods, far from the designated camping area. My heart raced. The site was supposed to be closed for the season, and no one should be there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As I got closer, I could see the tent was unzipped but empty. The campfire pit lay cold and dark, a few charred logs scattered around. I scanned the area, calling out if anyone was there, but only the wind answered. I was about to turn back when I noticed a backpack near the tent, half open, and inside, I caught a glimpse of a child's drawing. It was crude but depicted a family camping. My gut twisted. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence: laughter, distant yet unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and childish. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Children shouldn't be out here alone, especially in the dead of night. I made my way toward the sound, heart pounding. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling stillness. Then, I heard something else: a low growl. Unlike anything I had heard before, it sent a bolt of fear through me. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to see beyond the trees, but nothing moved. I hesitated, trying to rationalize the noise, convincing myself it was just an animal. With a deep breath, I continued, hoping to find the children and bring them back to safety. I stumbled into a small clearing and spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, among the foliage, stood a tall figure, its back turned to me. It wore what appeared to be a tattered, oversized sweater, the hem dragging along the ground. I called out, but it didn't move. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, as if sensing my presence. I felt the air grow heavier, and a chill swept over me. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I took a cautious step forward, and the figure suddenly turned around. My flashlight flickered against its face, a twisted, unsettling mask that was neither human nor animal. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and it opened its mouth to let out a haunting sound that mimicked laughter. The growl I heard earlier grew louder, but I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, heart racing. I crashed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes. I sprinted back toward the path, but the laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, getting louder with each step. As I emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath, I nearly collided with a family of 3 parents and a young child, their eyes wide with confusion. They must have arrived just as I was fleeing. I hurriedly explained what I had seen, the laughter, the figure. They listened, faces pale and frightened, but before I could convince them to leave, the laughter echoed again, louder this time, and the figure emerged from the tree line behind them. I shouted for them to run, and they turned in terror. The family sprinted down the path as I grabbed my radio, frantically calling for backup. I didn't look back until I reached the main ranger station, heart pounding. When the other rangers arrived, we formed a search party, but the woods were silent. We combed the area, but there was no sign of the figure, the tent, or the family I had seen. Hours passed with no trace, and as dawn broke, the sun illuminated the woods with a haunting beauty. Later, as we gathered to regroup, I heard the same high-pitched laughter wafting through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I turned to my fellow rangers, trying to shake off the growing dread. As we discussed the plan, I caught a glimpse of the child from the family had encountered earlier, standing at the edge of the woods, a grin on his face. But it wasn't just any grin. It was the same twisted smile I had seen on the figure. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The child wasn't lost. He was part of whatever was lurking in the woods, and now they had returned, watching, waiting. I had no idea what horrors lay ahead. The laughter echoed again, and I felt the woods close in around me. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, A voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. "Help us!" I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. "Where are you?" My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. "Are you okay?" I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights alone in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for that Halloween weekend. The air was thick with an eerie silence as I patrolled the trails, the trees standing like dark sentinels under the moonlight. Most campers had left for the season, leaving only a handful of brave souls to brave the chill. I didn't mind. The quiet was almost comforting. That evening, I received a radio call from a family camping in the more isolated part of the park. They were having a Halloween-themed campfire and invited me to join. I was hesitant, but agreed, thinking it would be good to check on them. I set out, flashlight in hand, making my way through the winding trails. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, casting unsettling shadows that danced around me. As I approached their campsite, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The fire flickered weakly, illuminating the faces of the family to parents and their young daughter, all dressed in Halloween costumes. They greeted me warmly, inviting me to sit with them. The smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air, and laughter echoed through the trees. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then, the girl, dressed as a ghost, pointed to the tree line. "Look, there's someone over there," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I turned to see nothing but the dark outline of the trees. The parents laughed it off, but my instincts kicked in. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or perhaps an animal. But as I settled in, unease settled in my stomach. The night wore on, and the girl continued to glance nervously toward the woods. She kept insisting there was someone watching us. The adults dismissed her claims, but I felt a prickle of fear. Just then, a loud rustle erupted from the bushes. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, its beam trembling. The parents jumped to their feet, trying to reassure their daughter. But as I stood, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall silhouette. My breath caught in my throat as I shone the light in its direction. The figure was thin and gaunt, its face obscured by a mask, but I could see the glint of something metallic in its hand. The parents screamed, and the girl hid behind her father. "Stay back," I shouted, stepping forward. The figure didn't move, its presence unnaturally still. Just as fear began to take hold, the family bolted in the opposite direction, leaving me alone. My instincts kicked in, and I followed, shouting for them to stop. We ran through the dark forest, panic rising with every step. I could hear the figure following us, its footfalls light yet relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The path twisted and turned, and I began to lose my bearings. The woods felt alive, branches reaching out like claws as we hurried through the underbrush. Suddenly, we burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating our frantic faces. The parents were panting, the little girl crying. Just then, the figure emerged behind us, and I instinctively stepped in front of the family. I was ready to confront whatever horror this was when, without warning, the figure reached up and pulled off its mask. To my disbelief, it was a fellow park ranger I worked with, wearing a goofy smile and holding a fake axe. "Surprise!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. The family and I stood there, stunned. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by frustration. What the hell was that? I yelled. The ranger explained that he wanted to give the campers a Halloween scare, but clearly, he had taken it too far. The family was just as confused, their fear slowly turning to anger. The little girl, wiping her tears, asked, "Is that a real axe?" "No, sweetheart, it's just a prop," he said, chuckling. Just then, I noticed something behind him, a rustle in the bushes. My heart dropped as I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Out of the shadows stepped a real figure, hunched and menacing, with a glint of silver reflecting in the light. The ranger's face drained of color, and I realized with horror that the prank had attracted something far more sinister. The family and I backed away, panic setting in again as the true danger revealed itself. This was no joke anymore. The ranger dropped his prop and we all turned to run, leaving the clearing behind, our previous fright replaced by sheer terror. The woods, once familiar and safe, now felt like a haunted labyrinth, every shadow a potential threat. In the end, we all survived, but I knew I would never see the woods the same way again. The night had started with a scare, but had turned into something real and terrifying. It reminded me that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are not just figments of our imagination, and the woods hold secrets that should remain undisturbed. It was supposed to be a carefree camping trip, a chance for me and my friends Mark, Lisa, and Jake to escape the daily grind and reconnect with nature. We drove out to a secluded spot in the national forest, far away from the noise of the city. The sun was shining, and we were all in high spirits as we set up our tents and prepared for a weekend of fun. That first night, we built a campfire and roasted marshmallows, telling ghost stories that made us laugh and shiver at the same time. As darkness fell, the shadows deepened, and the woods around us came alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. It felt magical until it did end single quotes t. Around midnight, after the fire had died down to glowing embers, I decided to take a walk. I figured some fresh air would help clear my head. I told my friends I'd be back shortly and ventured a few yards into the trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. That's when I heard a faint whispering coming from deeper in the woods. I paused, straining to listen. It was hard to make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, almost pleading. I called out, "Hey, is anyone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly. My heart raced as I turned back toward the campsite, deciding that my curiosity had gotten the better of me. When I returned, I noticed my friends were huddled together, looking uneasy. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to shake off my own anxiety. "We heard something," Lisa said, her voice trembling. It sounded like someone was calling for help, but then it just stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine. "You heard it too?" Mark nodded, glancing nervously at the dark trees surrounding us. "It's probably just some animal," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We tried to shake it off, playing cards by the fire. But every time the wind rustled the leaves, we all jumped. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension, and the whispers from earlier nagged at the back of my mind. Just as I thought I might be able to relax, a sudden cold breeze swept through the campsite, extinguishing our fire and plunging us into darkness. We scrambled for our flashlights, our hearts pounding in unison. In the dim glow of our lights, I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the trees, faint shapes flickering in and out of view. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. Before we could respond, the whispering returned, clearer now. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and unintelligible, as if they were trying to communicate something urgent. We stood frozen, unable to move, caught in a web of fear and curiosity. Then, as suddenly as it began, the voices faded, and the fire reignited, casting warm light around us. It was as if the forest had decided to relent, allowing us a brief respite. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Finally, exhausted, we crawled into our tents, vowing to leave at first light. That night, we barely slept, the whispers lingering in our minds. As dawn broke, we packed our things in silence, the weight of our experience heavy on our hearts. We left the campsite without looking back, relieved to drive away from the whispering woods. The experience was unsettling, but we all made it out alive, with a story that would haunt us for years to come. The forest held its secrets close, and we were just fortunate enough to escape without knowing what lurked within. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. Is that a person? Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. What was that thing? He gasped. I don't know, but we should pack up and leave, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. The fire, he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. What the hell? Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. Get away from the fire, I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story I'd heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows. As glinting like hungry predators, we reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a simple camping trip with a few friends in a remote spot we'd hiked to many times before. The kind of place where the trees are thick and the nights are dark, but that's what made it peaceful. We arrived late in the afternoon, set up camp near the edge of a small, fast-moving creek, and sat around the fire, talking, laughing, and enjoying the fading sunlight. As the fire crackled, the shadows grew long and the cold night air settled in. I was exhausted, so I retreated to my tent first. The others stayed by the fire, their voices fading as I closed the zipper behind me. I could hear the creek rushing, the whine through the trees, and the occasional pop of the fire. I was just starting to drift off when a sudden thud against my tent made me sit up straight. My heart hammered in my chest as I listened. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, brushing against the fabric. But the sound came again, closer this time, and then a scraping noise, like something dragging along the ground. I held my breath, hoping it was nothing. But when the sound came a third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The campfire was still burning, but my friends were no longer sitting around it. I couldn't see anyone, but the fire was still there, crackling merrily. I called out to them, my voice a little shaky. No answer. My pulse quickened, and a cold chill ran through me. Something was wrong. I crawled out of the tent, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The night was so still now, no sounds of the wind, no movement from the forest. I looked around the campsite, but there was no sign of anyone. The fire burned low, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The woods seemed silent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it again. A low, dragging sound, coming from the edge of the trees. I froze. This time, it wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, slow, almost methodical. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the dark, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, tall, thin, and unnaturally bent. I blinked and it was gone. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking. I backed toward the fire, my heart in my throat. The dragging sound continued, getting closer. And then, as if to taunt me, I heard a voice, soft, almost whispering, but unmistakable, come closer. The voice was unmistakably one of my friends, but it was wrong, distorted, like it was coming from a distance or through a thick fog. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave without finding them. I crept toward the trees, my breath coming in short gasps, the dragging sound getting louder. I stepped carefully, trying not to make a sound. I stopped just at the edge of the forest, peering into the dark. The light from the fire barely reached this far. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My friend's backpack, lying on the ground, half buried under fallen leaves. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall and hunched, its face pale, eyes wide and gleaming. I gasped, dropping the flashlight, the beam illuminating the figure for just a moment before it hit the ground. The figure tilted its head at me, and I could see that it was wearing one of my friend's jackets, but the face wasn't my friend's face. It was wrong. Where are they? I shouted, backing away. The figure made no move toward me, just stood there staring, its mouth twitching in what looked like a grin. I turned and bolted back to the fire, feeling the eerie sensation of being followed. When I reached the camp, I stopped dead in my tracks. My friends were sitting around the fire again, just as I had left them, but there was something off about them. They weren't moving, they weren't talking. Their eyes were open, but vacant, lifeless. I took a shaky step toward them, and that's when I realized none of them were breathing. The realization hit me like a wave. I had been talking to things in the forest. They weren't my friends, not anymore. They were something else, something that had taken their shapes. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back toward the forest, my eyes darting to the shadows. The hunched figure was no longer there. but I could feel it watching me. I ran. As I sprinted, I thought I saw figures moving in the periphery of the trees, shapes that resembled people, but too tall, too twisted. The sound of dragging feet followed me all the way back to the car. When I finally made it out of the woods, I never went back. The truth hit me too late. I didn't just witness something unnatural. I had stumbled across something that was waiting, patiently, for the next campfire.